Okay.
And then,
It's probably been a year. Is that about right? Maybe even more.
yeah, it might be maybe a little bit more.
Yeah. What have you been up to?
The last not much, a little less than a year ago, I got really sick. What I thought was a flu turned out to be massive E. coli infection. It was about 6 weeks of battling that and wasn't quite sure if I was keeping kidneys or whichever. Took some surgery to get going, and it got to the point where the E. coli was looking at the lab results, and they're just like, it's above the maximum that we count. I was like, crud.
You're all so that's not good.
Yeah, I'm like, does that get me like to put my name on the top of the screen? What do I get for this? So it's been back out doing sort of solo work, and so that was sort of a nice entryway back to that.
Yeah.
But it's I had ducked into a UX firm for a couple years prior to that, after shutting down my own solo adventure.
Yeah.
And then for about the last 9 months, I've been doing expert witness on a case that just wrapped, and it was in social software space. So I've spent the last 9 months to a year going back through the history of social software of 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And which has been really interesting, and a little depressing because there's not a whole lot that's really changed.
Sure. Well, I want to put you in touch, if you don't already know him, with Christopher Allen, because Christopher Allen has been sort of stockpiling content from 10, 15, 20 years ago. Not necessarily in the social software space, but more in the projects like Xanadu, like the we are going to reach, the internet that never was kind of stuff. Because there's a lot of people coming and revisiting ideas that had been visited 20 years ago and going, we're going to patent it. He's like, this is my patent busting file.
Yeah.
And he's really interested in protecting the commons. Chris is he was the co-author of the SSL standard.
Awesome.
And he has basically spent, his whole career trying to figure out how to improve collaborative capacity, right?
Cool.
And build tools that do that. And so SSL, which is, for those of you at home, the most widely used security protocol in the world. You use it every day whenever you go to a website or passwords, all that kind of stuff. And that just came out of his interest in trust. And he was interested in ways of doing collaboration. Went, in order for that, you have to have trust. Well, how does trust actually work? And sort of work backwards from there. And he's a tools guy, but he's a tools guy who's really into how does human trust really work. And he actually, I need to rope you into this because so he hosted something that I was trying to help bring some sponsorship dollars in for, and I participated in last week, called Rebooting the Web of Trust.
Oh, cool.
And basically, Web of Trust, that concept's been around for a long time. One of the most notable sort of milestones in that philosophical tract is PGP, which is pretty good privacy. And PGP is going to have its 25th anniversary next year. And PGP is an amazing tool that is used by very few people, right? Because its UX sucks. It has some other problems as well. And so basically he pulled together 3 of the 5 Bitcoin core developers, Vitalik Buterin, and another guy from Ethereum, John Callis, who was the former CTO of PGP, and now the CTO at Silent Circle, Black Phone. They do the privacy phone stuff. So basically, we pulled in all these guys, as well as some people you probably, Randy Farmer, and basically kind of tried to get a pretty broad group of people in the identity, privacy, and security space to do this little kickoff workshop where the price of admission was writing a white paper. So we got 25 or so pretty solid white papers on different things related to cryptography, related to reputation systems and their design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the goal is over the next 7 months to basically map out a different identity system for the internet. And or at least to be able to point to, hey, here's a path we can go down, or here's some code, right? So we're going to do some digital hackathons and some real in-person events as well. But the digital stuff allows us to participate a lot cheaper and have a much wider participation. But one of the big pain points there, obviously, is user experience and user experience design for those types of tools. And to be totally honest, like that skill set is not very well represented within the community that's been drawn together so far. They know it's really critical, but a lot of the folks there are like deep cryptographers or protocol heads, or like there's me, and I'm kind of closer to Randy and a couple of other folks. Where I'm really a political philosopher, right? I get how the tools work, but I don't build them. I'm like, no, but humans need this. So if there's any interest there, I'd love to make an intro and maybe rope you into some of that stuff.
Yeah, that sounds good. Every now and then I bounce across my PGP key. It's like have like 4 or 5 different address book entries for my own stuff in my address book or digital address book, and it's not on my main one. And I have them, one with everything on them, and it's and then there's one that keeps track of all the places that I've lived, and then there's like all the past work email addresses, all sorts of different things, and I have like a couple others that sort of, because of various devices that were in my life, sort of have their own cards. And one of them has my PGP key on it. I'm like, wait, where's the rest of this?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I've got one piece of it, but where? Like, there's a rainy Saturday afternoon adventure.
Yeah, exactly, right. And part of the stuff that these folks are trying to figure out is, and there's a handful of questions that they took on, but basically the whole workshop, the initial thing was like, what are the most important things? Like, what are the biggest, what are the places where we could have the most impact in, the 2 days, basically, plus, some follow-up work that we've got. And so the goal was to have that group sort of spew out 5 white papers, right, for this initial launch thing. And some of that stuff had to do with hierarchical keys and things like that. And others were dealing with, okay, what are the use cases and how do we design this stuff in a way that's going to work for humans, especially when humans are going to lose them or steal them? And if you don't have centralized stuff, like how do you get a new one? And all of those, there's all sorts of interesting conversations happening there that are interesting for really dorky people, right? Like, like super important for everyone else, but like nobody else is really wanting to listen in on that except for us. So,
cool. Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, the Christopher Allen stuff. I've got a collection. Part of the expert witness stuff was one that falls into one of the domains that I have an awful lot of history on.
Yeah.
But then also I've been keeping a Dev and Think repository. So on Mac, it's a database where essentially I tuck anything of potential interest in there. And so I've got over 40,000 objects going back to 2005. And so it's...
Do you know Jerry Mikulski?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it somewhat similar to his, the brain?
It's not as organized, and
Sure.
it's a
But it's your repository where you put all these. Are you able to connect
yeah,
them?
yeah. So they have tagging in it. Tagging came in probably about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and I had bounced out to like a couple other tools, and then I was able to take the whole repository and suck it back into DevonThink once it got tagging. And when I was working on,
I can see why you would be into that.
Yeah, many years back when I was working on a book on folksonomy, that I ended up having to set it aside because an awful lot of the social assumptions we were building upon didn't really work. They were all based on essentially early adopters.
Yeah.
And as mainstream folks came in, I couldn't explain the values we were getting because it was counter to the models. And I couldn't explain the problem sets and the concerns because it was counter to the models. And it took me it was a little over a year to deconstruct everything I knew. And going back to the public policy master's program, looking at various things from there, flattening everything, and then coming with models and building up these small models so I could look at things and hold a few models, and have been calling them lenses. So you hold up one lens, look at something, you're like, yeah, this fits, this makes sense. Let me pull another one, look at it just by itself, and like, this also makes sense. What do things look like together? And like, no, it doesn't work together. But this other one that makes sense on its own, and this other one that makes sense on its own, really help clarify things in the fog of complexity.
Yeah.
But by that point, the stock market had crashed. O'Reilly's like, yeah, we're going to cut about 20% of the books we're putting out this year, and yours has been sitting for a while. And with folksonomy in 2009, we're not expecting to be a hot seller.
Yeah.
So it just sort of fell off. But all of those lenses became really valuable, and I use them regularly and do workshops around them. And have value not only in the social, but also in just sort of general business and complex environments, and being able, some of the ones that have been sort of farther down the trail when I work on social stuff, the ones that come in like a second or a third day of working with folks, for general complexity stuff, those get bumped up, and it's like, okay, take a look at these 2 or 3 things. And those start leading to other things. And so it's working around those pieces. But when I was working on the folksonomy book, the thing that frustrated me with DevonThink was I couldn't find something on the web and tuck it away and keep a copy of it in PDF and say, this is chapter 6. Because DevonThink has just this insanely great search and fuzzy search, so I can find exactly what I'm looking for. And then I can open up a side drawer and it says, here's all the things that we think are highly related to this, which is absolutely insanely great as well. But the frustrating thing was I couldn't say this goes in chapter 5. And whenever I talk to the Devon folks, they're just like, yeah, we have really great search. Why would you need it? And I'm like, because your great search doesn't know what's in the chapters. I can't organize with it. And say, right. Here are the 45 things that I want to hold on to, for these next 3 chapters I'm writing, and I can't. Yeah. And so I had it in other stuff, but once it added tagging in it, their search had improved even more, and now I don't even search much. So I can go and find things that I have tagged, open up that side window and say things that are related, and that works really well. And I also find that like 2 years out from something, the context that I tag something in, that tag isn't as important as the context that I'm looking at it for in a 2-year focus. Because there's something else in that article.
How is it holding on to that context?
So it's so part of it is that there's things that I tag. It will also do auto tagging. And when I started doing it, its auto tagging wasn't great. Auto tagging the last year or so is getting fairly good, but it doesn't allow you to put your own context onto things really well. and it also doesn't sort of hit sort of new emergent terms and other sort of tangential items. And so it's quite often I'll look at something, I'll just take a stack of things that I have found in the last month or so or a couple months back and say, I'm just gonna, I've got an hour or so and just start tagging things, like scanning through things and just like, potentially interest, not of high interest. If it's of fairly high interest, I'll start tagging it.
Yeah.
And adding names into it, or this refers back to this other thing, and putting those sort of tags in there. But it's, and then you can also throw things in folders. And it wasn't until about a year ago. So Devin advises having directories and folders, no more than about 2,000 objects in them. And I've got all of my 40,000 objects in one directory. And but as soon as I move to a solid state drive and 16 gigs of RAM, I can search it and do whatever I want again.
Okay.
With only like 2 or 3 seconds delay. And that has made it highly usable again. But yeah, the other thing going through the expert witness stuff was just gaps of things, like giant chunks of things are just gone from the web. Things that are canonical, things that, I hold on to an awful lot of academic papers and, but like.
I need to introduce you to Juan Baptiste Vanette, if you don't know him already.
No, I don't.
IPFS. So Juan was one of the folks who was involved in this workshop as well. He's a young European guy I think he's living in New York at the moment.
Cool.
Who started a project called IPFS, Interplanetary File System.
Cool.
And basically he's taken a lot of the lessons from the Byzantine fault-tolerant networks, the BitTorrents of the world, those kinds of things. And he's basically gone through and mined a lot of the solutions that have been created in a wide variety of those. And gone, great, let's take the best and let's take the new stuff that's on the table and let's build a better one. But one of his primary passions, like I actually don't share this passion as much. But like, and I'll get into it why, but in a minute, one of his primary passions is archiving, right? He is like, nothing should ever be lost. Like that's his take on it. And for me, I'm like, well, there are things where we say, I would like this to be in the public, and sure, we don't want that to be lost just for technical reasons, just because like drives change and things like that, but there's plenty of stuff. My focus a lot of times is on privacy and transparency. How do you balance this? How do you enable individuals? Which actually leads me to a couple of questions, but I'll hold on to those for right now. I have questions related to the tagging and publication, really, because I'm fascinated with, and I think I've got some answers related to publication and trust and a lot of that stuff. And some of it, at the end of the day, like annotation is the ticket, right? Like, the ability to tag stuff is the ticket. And, but in order for people to actually do that and tag things in ways that are useful, they need to benefit from it. They also need not to have significant risk. They need to be able to constrain their risk. So, and at the moment, a lot of the sharing economy companies, a lot of the companies, and this goes back to Amazon and eBay, that are doing peer-to-peer marketplaces, they basically solve two problems. One, how do we get the user experience easy enough that there's no like speed bumps along the way to somebody doing what they want to do? And it's just intuitive, like they know why they're here and they're able to get that done. And then two, the reputation rating system stuff that fosters trust, where they go, okay, they've got enough of a history. They can see the reviews and they get the ratings and they're like, this guy's good. And they go ahead and move, right? And so to the extent that those systems are not adequately communicating actual human experience about, like, the place was a mess, et cetera, just because of the rating systems themselves and the ways that they're super public and humans don't want to, like, call one another out unless it was really bad.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of interested in seeing those reputation system things stretch beyond their limited, like, one's like niche, I'm renting a room in an apartment, you know, like, context. I want this stuff to be, each user has their own, like, environment that they're interacting with, but on the back end is this interconnected, you know, cross-domain world where they're drawing from resources, they're composing them together, they're getting information from here and there. The other thing, but a huge part of making that all work is giving people control to the extent possible over, hey, if I share this, I want to share it just with Thomas, you know. I don't want it to get, you know, back to that guy.
Yeah, even finding my own stuff, and because I'll, you know, visit, you know, another city, and I had been there before, and like being able to pull stuff back out of Foursquare or other places, and things from like, wait, where was that good restaurant? I thought it was going to be really easy to find it again.
It just
quite often
doesn't connect. Like it's not built to connect, you know?
Yeah. And it's like opening up apps I know that I had used, and I'm like, oh, I had it on my checklist. I'm like, oh yeah, the place was really good. But as soon as you check in, it moves it from your to-do list and goes off into the ether, not in the, like, hey, you were here.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, I want to go back there, and there's a place related to it, but I can't find that one place to find the other place that's related to it.
Yeah.
It's just, it many years back was had sort of a thought exercise of sort of this extended recommendation system or like to do system and sort of wish list, and understanding, you know, back in 2005, latency was the killer. So if you're trying to do a really good recommendation system on something like hamburgers, and there's many different types of hamburgers, and if you say, I'm looking for a good hamburger, there's that's you know, which of the 14 types of hamburgers do you call are your preferred types of hamburgers? Plus, what do you call, what is a good version of those? And so, you know, you could have, and Yahoo got close sort of in the mid-2000s by being able to say, oh, what did you have at such restaurant? It's like, oh, I really enjoyed the hamburger. And somebody else could say, I really enjoyed the hamburger. And you had tagged it as a hamburger place, even though it's like a steakhouse.
Style.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you just like, I could, you know, my ideal was being able to be walking around Amsterdam, have it be like about 6:30 in the evening, and know that's about the time that I would eat, and have the system say, hey, are you are you getting hungry? You haven't checked in to a food place. I'm like, yeah. And it's like, you know, what do you want? And it's like, I don't know. And they're like, well, there's a really good hamburger place.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hey, that sounds good. And it would know that it's the right kind of hamburger with, it could be 17 degrees of separation from my network, but it would be the right kind of hamburger, because when you start getting that granular and understanding, you know, what are the facets of hamburger and what is a good recommendation and who has recommended what and liked what that are similar to your taste around this one thing.
Yeah.
And the difficult thing around that was all the latency to be able to pull that all back together.
Actually, I'd love to hear if you've got a solution to that, but I had mapped out a solution to that in about 2008 that now we're open to implement. But
mine was just to start doing, most of the computations were like 2 to 5 minutes long, and now those are much shorter. If you have the data. If you have the data and you have everything there, it's, you know, a relatively quick computation.
I'll give you my back end, like the quick spiel on the architecture.
Yeah.
That changes that. two things. One, Juan's IPFS thing is all about low latency, right?
Yep.
So that is all about being able to draw even large files or large amounts of processing power from across a network. And I see his stuff interfacing well with the distributed cloud computing future. I've got other friends that are working on that stuff, right? Like peer-to-peer cloud, which is primarily compute, some storage, but also compute.
Yeah.
IPFS is more focused on storage.
Okay.
But if you talk to the folks at Cloudera, what are they really doing? They've got stock standard machines that have storage and some processing power there, and they're able to distribute send a job to a bunch of different machines, and each of those machines goes, okay, I'm going to do this amount of looking, and then send it up a layer. They're not having to send everything and process it in a central brain, right? So you get this tiered architecture where thinking can happen at each layer. Well, that's kind of similar to what I see as the answer to your type of how do I make sense of the world when the world is super complicated and each of us has a different view that's relevant on it. And the truth is, we do each have a different perspective. There was a guy who submitted a white paper after this last week's thing, and Christopher pinged me and one or two other people going, hey, is this worthy of inclusion? And I was reading the white paper and I was like, did I write this? I'm pretty sure I wrote some of this stuff in my paper. But the guy was basically saying, hey, look, when it comes to reputation, it's all about perspective. And the way that he framed it, and this is how I've always thought of it as well, I may even have a blog post on this. I don't know if I posted it or if it's in my drafts folder, on Einstein's theory of relativity. Right? If you take Einstein's theory of relativity and you apply it to information and content, information doesn't make sense unless it's in a context, right? And so all this stuff operates from a perspective. And so that was kind of his paper, was making that point. But there's another piece to this, and this is actually something that Friedrich Hayek talked about in Road to Serfdom 70 years ago, and that was, yes, we might disagree about the ends, but along the way to those ends, we're going to have areas where we do agree, where we're well, we might disagree about whether something is desirable, 60-degree temperature or 25-degree temperature. You like 60-degree temperature because it's not too hot, but it's not too cold, and I like 25-degree temperature because I can ski in it, right? And so we might have different value judgments on that, but we are still interested in the temperature itself. And so at that layer, we can both subscribe to and maybe support a data feed from a thermometer, right? And the way I see this stuff is in the sense-making, the grandiose systems or whatever that I've conceived of that are not yet built, although there's people working on building them. You end up having individuals publishing things. You have individuals, humans, you have machines, etc., publishing tags, the auto tagging type stuff you're talking about, or temperature data or biometric data, whatever, right? So they're publishing this stuff. They're publishing it in ways that conform to the desires of the controlling agent, right? If it's my watch, I don't necessarily want that being published publicly, but I might be okay with it going to my little device that can then, do its own. It could pull algorithms to it and perform analysis on it rather than sending that data to somebody else. Or if there's a trusted party, I'll send you my stuff because you guys are fine with me. But so you have individuals publishing information. You have others aggregating that information and making sense of it in some way, and then publishing something else out. And you end up with this ecosystem of kind of how I think of the brain working, right? You have essentially neural networks where the stuff that gets used gets stronger. It essentially gains support. And some of the reasons why these alternate internet architectures are interesting to me is that if it's commons based, if the back end networking stuff is entirely like, we are free and we'll only charge at the ends, you don't get self-regulation there. And so you end up having channels get sort of bombarded that are not getting additional resources as a result of that. And from my perspective, it's not a, oh, cool, just put pennies on it thing. Every bit is worth a penny. Like that's actually not the right way to do it. The right way to do it is I get to decide what is required, right? Like you want my temperature data from my thermometer, it might be free for you, right? It might be free for everybody. I could decide that I'm just willing to subsidize this. I could also make it, I'm charging you for every lookup. It could be that I'm charging you based on a subscription, and this is actually probably the way that this is the critical insight that I had in 2000. I guess it was actually 2007, not 2008. It was you set up subscriptions, so that thermometer has a bunch of people who are asking data to get pushed to them. Some of those folks are saying, right now the temperature is 59.5 degrees. If it hits 60, let me know. Others are saying if it hits 59.7 degrees, let me know, right? And so there's and what's happening is that thermometer, it experiences a change in state and it checks its subscriptions. And it pushes data to the people who have a subscription that says push the data then. Well, each of those folks, you might have that one thermometer. Well, you've got thousands of those around San Francisco. Somebody subscribed to all of those thousands, and they are basically aggregating that and averaging it. And they're publishing an average function. Somebody else is going, where's the hottest, right? And that could be the same guy making use of that information in multiple ways. But what you end up having is, if there are 100,000 people subscribing to that guy's average, and then he's subscribing to these 1,000 thermometers, then what you end up getting is a reduction of 500,000 queries, times 1,000 thermometers, right? So, if you have that in multiple layers, what you end up getting is pushing the data to the place where it's relevant. But you also end up having the end users, when they're writing algorithms about who am I going to turn to, and that could be a human writing that could be the kind of smart machines like figuring it out based on observing other actors in the system that they have the ability to observe, right? Figuring it out. But that ends up being I'm making a judgment call about how real time I need that data to be. Is it okay if this stuff is old, so long as I know it's within a degree? Like, that's good enough for me. Like, I'm not doing atmospheric, analysis. I just want to know if I'm wearing shorts. And so individuals end up making judgments themselves about how much do I need, and they experience pain or benefit. Wow, if I'm only getting the updates every 5 degrees instead of every 1/10 of a degree, then it's 100 times cheaper, right? And the other piece, and this was kind of where the IPFS stuff and some other things that my friend Garth Johnson's working on. Garth does a lot of stuff related to that whole peer-to-peer storage and compute. His focus is more on the compute side. How do you get individuals compensated for letting others use the processing power on their machines?
Nice.
The focus for me on all of those designs is in just the tech layer, not the what do humans think, but just storage versus bandwidth versus compute. Over time, those things are going to shift relative to one another in terms of cost. And they're also going to shift relative to one another in terms of topography. Like, where is the storage located? How far is that from the processing power? How expensive is the bandwidth? And my belief is, if you design those architectures right, your community self-regulates. It literally, if I have two options, I can subscribe to this temperature data thing that stores a ton of information. It caches it really close to me.
Yeah.
Or I can subscribe to this one where it does a real-time lookup. Depending on the infrastructure costs at that time, at that point in time, one of those is going to make better sense to me. One of those is going to be the more efficient, solves my problem better solution. And if you are able to get the network to if you can enable individuals to be able to sense the impacts of their decisions, and really at the end of the day, that's all this stuff is about. Like all these innovations are how do you enable individuals to sense that, oh, if I do this one, I'm wasting tons of resources, I pay more. If I'm doing this one, I don't. If you enable that, then you actually get that whole thing to kind of hum. You're constantly routing towards the appropriate balance of, how good is it versus how much strain am I putting on the system? And my belief is when you get to that point, you end up unlocking incredible amounts of collaboration, not in just the temperature thermometer thing, but in terms of sense making in the futuristic sci-fi way that you were talking about, essentially. But not just for hamburgers, but for literally everything. And to be totally honest, the grand vision there is, I think when you move into a place where collaboration, and that's really what that stuff is digital collaboration, where collaboration is that easy, you actually shift the transaction cost imbalance between individuals and institutions, right? Today, there's such a massive transaction cost advantage for operating within an institution that we see all kinds of problems in society that kind of stem from that. Institutions get served well, individuals don't. There's all these, I'm clicking terms of service because I'm never going to read them because I don't have a team of lawyers, that split the cost over millions of interactions. But I think when we start to, as we build these sorts of architectures, I don't think you ever get to even, but I think you bring that back quite a bit, and you'll see an acceleration of the trends that we've already seen in terms of moving away from in-firm work towards peer-to-peer work. But my hope, and this is why I'm not interested in just the pennies side, my hope is that you actually, and this is not just a hope, I'm trying to design for this, is that you actually get all of the value judgments by the individuals in the system being expressed, essentially, right? So I'm able to see, yes, that's an amazing hamburger. But according to the folks that I trust, they actually don't treat their workers that well. And that's something that matters to me, and so I'm going to steer myself away from them. And my hope is that actually gets you to sort of peer-to-peer regulation of behavior that is the opposite of the traditional marketplace race to the bottom. Because customers are able to sense and express preferences for not polluting a river, not using slaves, etc. And you're not dependent upon some central governmental entity to try to come up with policy and enforce that policy that's operating in a national context when we're in an international world. And so even they are sort of pressed in a race to the bottom game. So that's kind of the, sorry for the rant, but that's sort of the grand vision there.
Cool. Yeah, there was an awful lot in that was really good. And just, when you're talking about the temperature and being able to see sort of being able to aggregate widely through narrow services that then can have redistribution. And so, give me, every 10 seconds, give me an update from this one service, because what I'm wanting to see is during rush hour time, what's the change in temperature as people get closer to center core or around popular work destinations, to encourage people to bike or take alternate transportation. And and looking at sort of weather changes on weekends for those same routes, and just being able to say, oh, you can see, in San Francisco, the closer you get to anywhere from like the public library down to the financial district, going 2 miles wide, and watching the heat map change, and watching the heat start coming in these aberrant changes compared to a Saturday and Sunday morning at the same time with similar weather conditions.
Our work is.
Yeah.
Our work is so hot, you see the temperature difference.
Yeah. But it's one of the things just with 9/11, when the airplanes weren't flying, the weather patterns changed drastically in 2 days. And
you're like, oh.
Yeah, it's just being able to sort of see that, and it's like, I'm not going to, we can see a direct correlation of human impact on climate change in a 15-minute span. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, you can tell if there's a backup or a traffic problem, not by looking at Google Maps, but by looking at weather, micro weather. And they're like, oh, this has a 4-degree temperature increase. San Francisco 61 degrees is, this pocket in this 2-block area
going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it looks like it's a 1.5 mile backup just because of the change in the temperature patterns with the engines running. When we move to electric cars in the next 6 weeks, it's going to break all of that and the need for that. But for right now, it's like, oh, let's. Just being able to have that alternate view and just take that into account. Yeah. And being able to say, oh, do I buy something from Amazon, or do I go to my local store and pick it up? Yeah. And it's like, what's the heat map change to the earth of transporting that one book as a partial piece on a plane or a truck, to get it to my particular house, or me walking to the bookstore a mile away.
And sort of related to that example, for almost the entire time that I've had the general vision, one of the early things that I realized is when you start to have this sort of collaboration available to you, when you have these kind of tools, and at one level the tagging is key, right? The ability for somebody to go, wow, that was great. Even if that's an auto tag, right? Like the package showed up when I thought it was going to show up. Ends up enabling people to steer towards those that are providing good service, whatever good service means in that context, and away from others that are not. But one of the earliest examples that I was like, oh, this is a no-brainer, was peer-to-peer mail distribution, right? Yeah. And the way that I think that will eventually go is you're gonna have your little auto self-driving car. Yeah. You're gonna have some amount of storage space in that vehicle, and you're gonna have other humans or robots, little drone type things that can basically grab a package off of one car, put it onto another, and that package can piggyback its way across the country, basically taking the fastest, cheapest route, and getting there like that, with each of those people getting paid along the way, so that's just the same architecture applied in physical space. Yeah. But it's one of those like, that's not too far off. But you do have to have, you do end up needing those functional rating systems, and you also are, just like we have today, you're going to have other sorts of risk mitigation there, right? Like you're going to have insurance, you're going to have other things for, well, what if a tornado picks up that car, and all those kinds of things.
Cool. Yeah, the IPFS sounds really interesting, because one of the odd things in going back in the 5 to 10 years was looking at Wikipedia and the Wikipedia not having it, but I'm like, oh, it'll be in the Wayback Machine because it's in Wikipedia and it's a canonical component, and it's not in the Wayback Machine. And I'm like, where, how?
Yeah.
And so I would just start searching. I'm like, okay, here's who wrote it here. And then there's sort of like commons groups and groups that are focused on like solving these niche problems sort of around the edges of social.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, there's a really good group, and it was there 6 months ago, and it's gone.
Yeah.
And it started in 2006, and I took it for granted that it would always be there.
Yep.
And just it's people are like, it was there, served its purpose. I don't need to update the domain. I don't need to hold on to it. There's no need for this.
Sure.
And it's like, crud, how do we? And I'm like, kept thinking, if I had access to everybody's Dev and Think repository and just search for that URL, if I could then pull it out of it, or
Sure.
something like Pinboard, because Pinboard, if for the archive accounts, you pay $25 a year, and it will do a text archive of the pages that you bookmark. And it's like, I want to, since it's gone from the web, I want to be able to see if that URL exists in anybody else's archive.
Sure.
And just to get text out of it.
So there are a couple of projects that may end up helping in that down the line, maybe even in that like retrieval of the past.
Yep.
Not just the storage of the future, but the retrieval of that.
Yep.
The main project that I am interested in and helping to bring into the world at the moment is something called Metacurrency, run by Brock and Eric Harris Braun. They are two guys based out of New York that have a long background in community building and community currency design. Arthur in particular, long background in community currency design. And their current project is called Scepter. So they, like me, they sort of dove down the rabbit hole and went, well, in order to do that, you would need this. Oh, but in order to do that, you would need this. Oh, but in order to do that, you'd need, And when they got to the bottom, they were like, oh, you actually need protocols that interoperate.
Yep.
You need to be able to, what they kind of concluded was that at the end of the day, you need to be able to receive something that you have no idea what this is.
Yep.
And then to be able to go and get the thing that helps you understand it, download the interpreter or whatever, so that you can use it. And so they call that sort of receptivity, right? The ability to receive something and then go look up. And XML has some similar concepts in it.
Cool.
But this is not just about a document, this is protocols. So this is a self-describing protocol stack.
Cool.
So I can receive something, it says, here's the protocol, I can go download the protocol. Today, protocols are human-written documents that describe how you need to design your software in order for it to play well with this other software.
Yep.
Basically. Or human-written documents that describe how you are supposed to do work in this business in order for you to deliver this value to a customer, right? So those are instructions that are not implementable. And what they're doing is sort of reconceiving of protocols as pluggable objects.
Cool.
And they're launching in January.
Cool.
So working on that for years. And I'm helping to organize the tech community side of that. I know we're at about an hour. Do you have another meeting?
No, I don't.
I don't either. So, so yeah, that's Scepter, and then and one side of that is essentially they have what's called the compositorium, which is like a GitHub repo sort of thing. Like it's sort of like as if the internet had a built-in GitHub, right? Okay. Cool. So that it's sort of that kind of concept is part of that. The other piece there is that at the base of their compute, they basically took a swipe at rewriting the whole computing stack based on how natural systems function.
Okay.
Right? they went and looked at nature and went, all right, well, how does nature do this stuff? And like, well, it sort of organizes within like membranes. You know, you have a cell, and that cell has something that divides things that happen on the inside from things that happen on the outside. And that cell is kind of like a decision-making layer about what comes in and what goes out. And so they ended up designing Scepter to be essentially this set of lightweight virtual machines that you can spin up. We'll do a process, and then you can spin them back down. But at the, baked into the lowest layers, they've done it as semantic trees. So there's no way in their system to store an integer. You can't say 7. You can say 7 pounds.
Okay.
Say 7 apples, right? So the semantic content needs to be stored with the quantifier, I guess. And what that does, and I ended up picking their brain early on when they were first explaining it, because I was like, okay, this sounds good, but at one level you can think of that as from the author's perspective, this is what this thing is. It's 7 apples, right?
Yep.
You might take that, and this is this is my worldview on this stuff. I thought, oh, 7 apples. You take it and you're like, well, that's just apples. Like, those are very rare, Northern Fuji apples, not to be confused with the everybody has it in their grocery store, Southern Fuji apples. And so you may end up distinguishing and parsing and adding your own meaning to that, which from my context might not be relevant. But from your context, be very relevant. You may share that with everybody in the world, and some of those people may decide Thomas is total expert when it comes to apple varietals, and so yes, I'm gonna. But baked into all of that is an assumption that I have, which I think you're going to share just because of your lengthy experience with taxonomies, folksonomies, etc.
Yeah.
Ain't no such thing as true.
Yes.
Systems, right? Like, that's not the goal. The goal isn't to elicit true or truth. The goal is to elicit trusted, useful.
Yeah.
And I had written in one of my white papers for Web of Trust that, like, nature will pick useful over true any day of the week.
Yep.
Right? Doesn't give a fuck about the underlying, all the details. Yeah. If that's good enough for me to take an action, I can take the action. So anyway, I'm ranting.
Yeah, there was a couple years back, I did a keynote at a eLearn conference.
Yeah.
And right before it, one of my favorite TV shows, it's a British sort of comedy game show.
Okay.
Which is a British genre where you have comedians as the panelists on these game shows, and it's to be, get the right answer as well as be entertaining.
Yeah.
So everything sort of drifts in the meantime while you're getting to the answer. And but one of them is QI, which stands for Quite Interesting. It's hosted by Stephen Fry. And it's this comedy game show genre in a different way where the right answer is incorrect because it's the publicly considered correct answer.
Got it.
And so it's, how many legs does a centipede have? And it's like, more often than not, it doesn't have 100. It has 102 or 98. But it's like the 8th option or the 9th best option is 100. Yeah. But that is not the most common.
Yeah.
So it has things like that in it. And on their 10th anniversary show, which was like a week or two before I was giving this talk, in the first year of the show, they asked, how many moons does the Earth have? And everybody said 1. It set off all the alarms. They're like, wrong, you're losing points.
You're losing points.
Yeah. So if you say the right answer, which is the wrong answer, you lose points. And so you want to be able to give the actual true answer and explain why. And I end up learning a lot and laughing a lot quite often. But the question of how many moons does the Earth have has come up 3 times with different answers. And so they brought it up on the 10th anniversary show, and it was yet another different answer. And they're like, well, this is to start looking at the half-life of truth. And so they looked at all of the correct answers that were correct over the 10-year span and found that about 60% of the correct answers over that 10-year span were wrong currently, because the answers had changed. Science had gone and looked at it a little more tightly. Mm-hmm. And I was like, crud, this is incredibly valuable. What is true today? And it was going back, and it brought up, blanking on his name. I know my book that should be right behind me isn't, because I was doing a new workshop on what can 100 plus years of social sciences teach knowledge managers, community managers, which turned into an exercise of getting all of my books off the shelf.
Sure.
Gordon Rugg, that's who it is. And so Gordon Rugg has this thing that he developed called the verifier method, which is essentially looking back at history and looking back at scientific invention and research and saying what was right 15 years ago and is now wrong. What decisions were based on that, and looking at things along the lines of, like Alzheimer's, all sorts of different things. Yeah. And so things that scientists have ruled out as not being possible because of scientific experiments where that experiment is no longer correct and valid. Yeah. And being able to go back to those points in history and say, let's rerun these branches of inquiry again. Yeah. And he also got well known because he got written up in Wired magazine. That's how I stumbled on him, because he had become the person to explain the Voynich manuscript the closest, which is this. It's a cryptographic story gift that nobody knows where it came from. And through using his verifier method, he was able to rule out all the different methods of cryptography that could have created this. Got the rough date line, and so it had been a gift to a king, and which gave it value. But nobody understands it, and people are like, "This is a treasure map? Is it a hoax? What is this?" If it's coded and it takes an awful lot of work to answer it, it must be something really good in it. And what he had come up with to be able to start solving it was they were using a grid system. In these carded grids, and you just fill in the grid and flip the grid, turn them, and it works for about 95% of what's in there, and then it has some oddities. And so he figured out what the grid patterns were and created the cards and came up with something incredibly close, but didn't fully solve what it was. But his writing about it, and then Wired covering it, I'm like, wow, this is absolutely brilliant. And I was more interested in the verifier method than the Voynich manuscript piece, which as soon as I blogged about it, which was as soon as I had read it, the following morning I had an email from him. It's like, hey, let's talk. And I was like, and he now has a book out within the last couple of years or so. And it's all on that sort of like, truth is only current today, and it shifts based on time and what is correct, but also I've taken the William Gibson the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, and I talk about the every now, which is the gap of and the breadth of that unequal distribution of the future. So there's some people who are just getting fax machines and think, holy crud, the future is here. And I continually run across those people. I ran across somebody like 6 weeks ago. They're like, oh, we got a fax machine finally. And they're like, it's amazing.
Nobody uses uses those anymore.
I'm like, who do you send stuff to? But they had subscribed to a couple things that were giving them newsletters, and I was like, wow. And I'm like, wait till they get email or all this other stuff, and it's the gap of the every now, I'm guessing, is as wide as it has ever been in history.
Sure.
And because it's like about a 20, might be close to like a 30-year gap of things that people are like, no, this is technically possible. This doesn't exist in our world.
So here I'm gonna build on top of that briefly.
Nice.
So I see a lot of people who I'm gonna actually take a note. There's one other thing I want to talk about before I forget. Okay, cool. There's a lot of people who go, the world is changing. There's whole industries of consultants who basically their job is to go to business, and somebody in the high end of management is like, whoa, we need to light a fire under our people's asses. Yeah. Right? Like that's big. And so they bring somebody in who helps those people to wake up to the fact that, hey, the world's changing really fast, and you guys might become dinosaurs soon if you don't get your shit in order. And the military's term for this, which has become more popular, is VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. VUCA is increasing, right? So the world is, but very few of those people know why. Nobody talks about why. They're like, oh, it's changing, and change is happening faster and faster. We know it's happening faster and faster. And so our institutions are not structured in ways that keep up with that. That's all true. But they don't talk about why. And the why is pretty simple. Communications technology.
Yep.
That's it. Communications technology has made it so that the time delay between me coming up with something and somebody else being able to build upon that has collapsed from decade to literally, you said you posted that blog post and he was like, hey, let's have a conversation, right? Like that is going back to a day, right? Like, oh, great. We're now going to collaborate and build upon this. And a buddy of mine, well, he's not a buddy, but he's somebody who I met and I respect a lot. I would like to spend more time with him. A guy named John Seeley Brown. Did some interesting stuff on surfers, right? I'm a surfer. But he basically, he knows how to sex stuff up. The whole thing was like digital media allows us to build on top of one another's efforts more quickly. And his example was a surfer, some pro surfer somewhere, lands a maneuver for the first time. He's got a film guy. They post it onto YouTube that night, or now it's Instagram, right? And within a day or two, other people around the world are trying and landing that maneuver, right? And then they're trying to top it, trying to build upon it. Well, surfing's not, the most useful of endeavors for people to be building upon, but that same pattern applies everywhere. And so my company is called Collaborative Advantage, right? Why? Because my belief is if you want to improve the capacity for a community to thrive, right? If you want to give them an advantage in their environment, there is no better innovation that you can do than improving their collaborative capacity. If you're able to make an impact there, that is the most leverage because it impacts everything else. And my little rant on this usually starts with, we've had this throughout all of human history. Writing gave us it was an enormous advantage over not having writing, right? Just pictographs. Suddenly you can capture information and you can share that idea over time and at a distance. When we were writing on things that were like walls, you couldn't do it at a distance. You had to bring the other people to the wall. But when you're able to write on, smaller things that you could carry, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll kind of leave it there. So collaborative advantage, that's where you get your most bang for buck. The other thing that I was going to mention is abundance. A lot of the people that are, especially the people that are in that, like, the consulting space, which I am, like I do consulting work, right? But a lot of those people that are in that space, and and a lot of the people who are working on the types of technologies that we're talking about are motivated in part by this vision of abundance, of getting to a world where we will never have to want.
Yeah.
I want to sort of pop that balloon. That is not well, I'll reframe abundance a little bit. Abundance, in my mind, means we have so much that we don't have to be sensitive to the impacts of our actions. Right?
Yeah.
I've met people like that. They're the children of wealthy individuals.
Yep.
That doesn't tend to work out so well, right?
Yeah.
Those people end up having often emotional trauma and major problems related to that, because humans aren't built to not have strain. Strain and stress is what, stress is what leads to growth. I had a conversation with a chicken farmer that kind of pointed that out, and I was like, oh, he was talking about literally birds, and how you get bigger birds.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, that's true. Like, we grow in the directions in which we are stressed to an extent. Too much stress and you're crippled. But the basic gist of it was, instead of focusing on abundance, on leading to a world where the machines will do all of the work and we can have leisure. Like, I've had good chunks of my life where I've gotten to have lots of leisure, and leisure is way overrated. Right? That is not the good life. Slavery is not the good life either. Yeah. But leisure is not what all it's cracked up to be. For me, the focus shouldn't be on designing for abundance, because if you design for abundance, like we were talking about natural systems earlier, if there's a whole bunch of food on the ground, like there was at one point when humans first figured out how to kill large mammals, like it was like, oh my God, there's food everywhere, and we just went on a rampage, and our population exploded, right? Yeah. It was like good times, there's food, we're having babies, boom, 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 and we grow to the size that our environment can support, and suddenly it's no longer good times. So all abundance does is give you this limited time frame in which you impact your environment and aren't yet able to feel it. There's a time lag where you are wiping out massive amounts of stored biological wealth, all the genetic diversity that had been accumulated. But you're just like, wow, we're getting to eat and have babies, and you're not checking yourself. So as the great philosopher once said, check yourself before you wreck yourself. And my take on it is, no, don't design the systems with abundance as the guiding principle. Design systems with self-regulation as the guiding principle. And what that really means is enable people to feel pain. Enable people to sense the impacts of their actions as far away as they can feel is relevant. But if you can enable that, then what you actually, I'll frame this a little differently. I'm gonna come at this from a different vector. You have coherence layers. So you've got like the humans, and then you have the humans and the animals that they're eating. Right? So this is a larger ecosystem that they exist within. Each of those is a coherence layer. At each layer, there is a certain orderliness. It's not completely independent and separate from the adjacent layers, but it has its own way of working. My body, is different from this cell phone. They're able to interact. Heat is able to flow from one to the other, etc. But they are separate things, so they have a coherence layer. When you have adjacent coherence layers, and you create abundance in one, it often creates disruption in another. Right? However, I think this leads to a critical insight. If you can experience disruption at one layer, you can actually create harmony in another. And so that at the root of the systems that I'm trying to design, and the way that I think about the political philosophy stuff, is if we can enable individuals to experience tiny pains, literally, if I did that, I would contribute 6 steps removed in a supply chain to polluting a river. But if I did that, it's local, organic, and they treat their people nice, and yada, yada. That moment of being able to sense what that would be is, to some extent, a pain, and leads to the ability to make a decision, which eventually, once you zoom out a bit, you see, whoa, that results in a world of us not having a race to the bottom. The other pain that exists there, honestly, for that individual is if I have the capability to sense that if I buy this one, it leads to slavery. I am a slave user, right?
Yep.
And if I buy that one, I'm not. I suddenly gain the responsibility.
Yep.
Not just in a moral sense, but in a other people might hold you to account sense. If I'm a sandwich shop, hey, where'd you get your flour from? Oh, we got it from this guy. Those guys pollute the river. I get held to account. And so with capability comes responsibility. That is a pain point. That does end up leading individuals to have to be responsible. That's annoying. Being responsible is annoying. But the alternative is that we aren't able to exercise control over our lives, and we suffer from these game theory style, prisoner's dilemma by problems that have left us with, essentially, at the end of the day, a global regulatory system that doesn't function, right? And my belief is through these tools and processes and ways of doing life, we can actually have our first functional global regulatory system. It's not a centralized thing. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's based on the value judgments that you make and the communities that you're interested in interacting with make. But that can actually work, and we may be able to not kill off all the species by accident. So there you go. There's the rant again.
Cool. Have you seen the? It's a video how the wolves changed the rivers in Yosemite.
No.
I just ran across it in the last week or two. I think it's recent, within the last 2 or 3 years. But it's a 5-minute sort of documentary about how reintroducing the wolves back into Yellowstone had completely changed the ecosystem, down to changing the patterns of the rivers, because the riverbanks were then stable, because it was amazing all the things that it touched by reintroducing the wolves, and it put it back into balance.
Sure.
And had been completely out of balance.
Wow.
And so it was just...
Check that out. Yeah, I was having a conversation along those lines about went surfing up, and I'm a big wave surfer, right? So I was surfing up in Mendocino, 3 hours north of San Francisco earlier this week, and we're realizing there's no kelp. There's no kelp, and we were walking out, and we're like, why is there so little kelp? It was like, oh, no sea otter. Because there's no sea otters, they're not eating the urchins, and so there's a huge number of urchins, and the urchins basically eat the kelp roots. And so it's like, okay, cool. So I see where this came from, But it's that sort of things work backwards.
Yeah.
You would be really interested if you haven't read it. And this was a book that Arthur Brock, the guy from Scepter Metacurrency, recommended to me. Actually, I'll give you 2 book recommendations. But the first one is Seeing Nature by Paul Kraffel, Krafel. Brilliant book, beautifully written, gentle, a quiet book, written by a guy who basically walked around in nature for a really long time and is describing the patterns that he saw.
Cool.
And I think that there are a couple of things that he doesn't dive into that you can go, oh wow, and extend what he's talking about there. And then in some of his speeches, he actually has extended some of the patterns he's talking about to human relationships and government and decision making. But Paul Kraffel, Seeing Nature, amazing. The other one, and Kraffel's book is really story based. It is him telling stories, and then occasionally there's and so here's the abstract principle, but it's stories. This other book is I had spent much of the last year doing sort of political philosophy work rooted in ecosystems.
Cool.
Right? Rooted in that whole cell membrane kind of context. And just studying how ecosystems work and thinking about what the lessons are that you can draw from those and apply to social groups. And I'd come to a bunch of conclusions that actually led me to leave the religion that I was raised in. Even, not that I was, like, I still feel like, oh, that's really useful, but I'm like, oh, it's not totally right. But I picked up a book a couple months ago as a result of like a Facebook conversation and started reading through it. I was like, this fits with my worldview.
Cool.
And that book was called Panarchy.
Okay.
Panarchy, Understanding Transformation in Human and Natural Systems. Could you ask for anything better? It's a really academic work. It was done by a group of ecologists.
Okay.
And I don't think they use the word coherence layer, but that concept that they are basically mapping out how do ecosystems achieve coherence? How do they, from a whole bunch of options, sort of centralize around one sort of set of collaborations, and then that thing sort of outcompetes everything else. But then eventually that becomes so efficient and effective, but also brittle. It is really a singular approach, something that really fits its current context well and isn't so good at fitting a slightly different context. There's a release moment where the forest burns down, or some new bug wipes out the field or whatever. And then there's this reorganization period that where it's like all of the energy and resources that were released in that event is now serving as the food of these other things that are, coming in and going, oh, we're trying to establish ourselves. And you go through this cycle again where it's, what's the new thing that's going to come to dominate the landscape? And they talk a bit about how those different, layers are related to their surrounding layers, the larger ecosystem, the subparts, et cetera, and how disruption in one ends up impacting another, and how you draw upon, if you have the forest fire and the forest burns down, the larger ecosystem that you exist within is going to largely determine what is going to emerge. The seeds that are left in the soil from previous generations, all the critters that are nearby, as well as the rainfall patterns and the shape of the landscape and how much wind you have, all of those things end up being the variables that determine, that basically are the context and determine which of the many, possibilities becomes the dominant one that next go around. So super interesting.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds good. It's they keep on, within the last probably about 10 years, increasingly coming back to adoption, and it's heavily related to the rapid pace of change in organizations that don't necessarily focus on disruption, but they're comfortable with constant change. And they're like, change is what we need to be comfortable with. How do we adapt? How do we see our systems, what we do, and how do we work in far more flexible ways? And a lot of large organizations always have been looking for the best practice. And in complex environments, when you get an organization above even 50 people, you are dealing with a complex environment, which best practices don't work in. You need things, one size does not fit all. You need things that
fit for purpose.
You need more than one approach, and it's, selling that and making that is easy to understand, and having, when looking at social tools in most organizations that are over 500 to 1,000 people, they've got more than one social platform more often than not.
That's right.
And almost all have Salesforce chatter, but folks outside marketing and sales won't touch it. It doesn't fit their mental models. It doesn't.
Their engineering team is using GitHub, and
And so it's, the big thing is being able to interleave all of them, being able to see the conversations. Slack has become a fairly good umbrella for doing a lot of that. it searches a little too good, and it needs to sort out its messiness and provide filters, because the mainstream folks just their minds are popping when they look at everything that's coming through Slack, and they're like, how do I find the things I have
cognitive load is just way too high.
Yeah. And so it's and particularly if they're focusing on enterprise, you're dealing with large populations of mainstream and trailers to mainstream. Yeah. But it's, pointing out that organizations that have really good social platforms and online social collaboration and cooperative and collective tools, they have more than one. And people are like, oh, this company is doing it really well. They use product X. And then you also realize they're also using Y, Z, A, and all these others.
Totally.
And it's just...
And they have cultural processes in place.
Yeah.
That suit and fit, and they have the ways of treating the humans in their environment in ways that make them comfortable and willing to share these things. Yeah.
Yeah, and quite often
the tool solves it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's quite often the tools create sort of small neighborhoods or small communities within the overall network where people feel comfortable. They're not overwhelming. You know who most of the people are. And I do an awful lot of talks around social comfort, which has 3 tenets, which is tools, people, and content. And what content are are people comfortable sharing 100%? What is... In 2008, I was working with a couple of organizations where it was getting really problematic because trust was their big thing, and you can't qualify trust if you're trying to design a better solution and figure out what's wrong. But also, trust has 7 definitions, and I'm like, define trust how you are intending it. They define it, and they're like, oh, it's this. This is the trust I'm talking about. And within 2 sentences, 3 sentences, they have shifted to another form of trust. And it's like, define that one and point out that they've shifted. And I'm like, you cannot use the word trust. You've got to use a proxy term. Tell me what you're meaning. And, there was confidence in people. There was, reliability. And the one that stuck out for being able to understand tools was comfort. And I could sit down with people and like, you're not using the tools or you're having problems with it. Are you comfortable with using it? And they're like, no, I'm not. And they can tell you why. What would give that? What's standing in their way? And I'm like, with trust, they just have a blank look. No, I don't really trust it. And they can't say why. And I'm like, comfort was opening the box. And so you've got with the tools, and sometimes it's people like, I don't know who these other people are. I'm connected in this community with 300 people. I know 6 of them. So we have a subgroup on, something that work doesn't provide, so we can talk. And through them, we know about 35 people altogether. So you sort of have this next level of trust, and you start trust or comfort. And it starts at, you start looking back at Reed's Law, which is people join groups where they find affinity or interest, and where the whole group starts drifting from their core interests, they split off and have a subgroup. And so you have all these sort of small communities, and then when the small communities don't see the whole and how they fit in the whole, they split off and start their own complete group.
Separate, yeah.
And so it's like, this is all natural, and why you don't get to one size fits all, one platform in an organization. Yeah. But getting to the social comfort piece, our profile tools don't help us understand who each other are. The tools aren't able to use some understanding and saying, oh, this is how you're connected to Matthew. These are the people. Here are the things of common interest. Here are common books. Here are common threads. And surfacing those things first and then saying, here are all the other things. What we see is something written by, I see something written by you because that's how things are set. And I have to scan through it, and our minds are fairly good at finding things that we have interest in and filtering out the things that we don't. So quite often those things will pop to the forefront, But if we have any sort of strain or other things, our brains aren't necessarily working in that manner. And I'm like, I don't see those. I'm like, why would I talk to Matthew? And so it's like putting those things that provide those bonds and bringing those to the forefront. So every time each individual is looking at somebody's profile, and the profile is slightly different to everybody. And so the tools are essentially providing Goffman's presentation of self from the tool outward. And it's like, oh, this person's going to be interested in this. And then the tricky part becomes understanding, how does Matthew understand me? What are those contexts? He's connecting, and it's like one of those LinkedIn things where like, why are you connecting with me? And it's like, they're like, oh, I need some help. I heard, I was pointed to you because you could help me with something. I'm like, what? What
is that for me?
Yeah, start narrowing this down, and it's, I don't like using the term about myself, but I get labeled with it a lot as the polymath. I'm like, oh, you have this expertise and this depth from these angles. And they're like, that's what I need help with. I'm like, okay, I can help you on that side. And quite often they'll look at the other things that I know, and they're like, there's no way he can know and be good at these two things. It's like, working in the UX and design field, most business folks are like, no, I don't want a designer looking at my stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, they also code. No, that's an IT guy.
They're not.
You have a background in policy and econ and analytics. No, that's going to influence a different way. Economists work in fuzzy things.
Can I dive in on that side just a little bit?
Yeah.
And what is it? What were the things? I mean, I'm assuming, there's some natural gifts there, right?
Yep.
But what do you think the environmental contributors were from early childhood, whatever, that enabled you, and I've got my own thoughts for me, but that enabled you to become that person?
The one that seems to stand out sort of early on is Montessori school. And just they encourage, that model is sort of a self-discovery, planting the seeds to have kids do a deep dive into whatever, whether, have a 4-year-old looking at addition and then showing them multiplication and seeing what clicks and providing the stepping stones to understand going from from adding and simple math to multiplication. And because I think I was like 4 or 5 when I started playing around with multiplication, and it was all because of the tools. The seed was planted, and we would also get encouraged in working and embracing large words. And it's like, as a 4-year-old was using Metropolis and was using other things because I'd been introduced to them, and it was sort of, it was a quasi self-competitive system, but the approach was essentially, look at Susie. Susie just, look at what Susie just did. She knows how to spell this 5-syllable word, understands what it means, and she's using it properly in sentences. Like, oh, I can do that. And like, help me. And all of a sudden you have these like little kids having just like these bizarre vocabulary for, 4-year-old, 5-year-old kids.
Because it was fun.
It was fun. And it also, one of my friends just did he's in user experience, but also looks at sort of education patterns and behavioral, and how to use those influences. And he gave a talk on Montessori as sort of a guiding principle, and just sort of how a lot of the things that, there's a few other sort of Montessori folks and people that are somewhat polymath, but also go deep and also look at things without regards to bounds at times. And a common trait across many of us is that we were all Montessori kids. And one of the traits in Montessori is that it breaks the understanding of rules and bounds. And it's just like, oh, if I think this, you know, a 5-syllable word, of course that fits easily with understanding multiplication, and just like having these really odd connections and building and being comfortable with thinking of things, you know, outside the box. And as many times as I've moved and, you know, joined different communities where I've lived or school or work or whatever, a common phrase has been, they're like, Thomas thinks out of the box. And they're like, no, we don't know that Thomas knows there is a box. And I'm like, I always look at things and then try to understand the constraints and how I can push those constraints and what I can move through. And like, here's your answer. But, you know, bring together this wide array of things where I have done deep dives. And I'm like, I don't understand this. And I'm like, it's interesting. Let me hold it on its own. And all of a sudden start drawing lines between things. I'm like, oh, these disciplines, here's how they're related. So I think an awful lot of it is Montessori school, also being an only kid, and dealing with adults. And my parents would take me to dinners and parties and stuff, and I would hang out and have conversations. And my son's an only child, and his teachers were just like, he's sitting in the class and having like the most grown-up conversations with other kids. Yeah. And like, as soon as he steps away, those grown-up conversations shift to more like kid level conversations. But I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And
because he's used to having,
he'll ask a question. Yeah, and he'll ask a question about things, and I'm like, if I know something about it, I'll do a deep dive on, why when we go through a tunnel, can we not get satellite radio? And I'll start explaining radio frequency and rain attenuation and all these things that I picked up from working in that area. Yeah. And public policy and telecom and satellite for a few years. I was like, oh, this is how it works. And so I approach how to, explaining it also sort of sets in place how to think about things and pull things together. And it's like, oh, here's a gap here, and understanding that where there's gaps and how you can fill them in or not worry about them. And so I think those two things had an awful lot to do with it. I struggled in high school because I was just incredibly bored, and I was highly structured. And when I went to college, which was at St. Mary's College in the East Bay, just over the hill from Berkeley, it is mostly based on students teaching themselves. So the teachers in the classroom to guide. And most of the classrooms are set up with circular tables with large, it's like a giant donut that'll seat 20 to 30 students, and you discuss the works, and you start with the foundational works of whatever your major is, and then you work through the understandings, and then you walk through everything that builds on it. So it's sort of this, like a Montaigne fountainhead, and going to the fountainhead of knowledge, and where did these ideas come from? And so they also have a great books program, which there's a great books major called Integral, based on the Santa Fe St. John's College model, and also the Annapolis St. John's model. But essentially, like your freshman year, you start learning algebra from the Greeks and who invented it, and then you work through chemistry, and you're learning through everybody who created things. Wow. And building this like foundation of knowledge based on people who discovered and created, and then looking at how that changed over time. Very different
from it being divorced entirely from the human discovery experience, and instead like, this is how things work. Yeah. It's a lot more humble. Like there's a humility and like a, and it's more story. Yeah. Yeah, and my last undergraduate semester I took in England at the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies in Oxford. And so it was in the tutorial system, which is the hyper self-teaching, where they're like, here's the one sentence,
go teach yourself the answer to this sentence. Come back with a 6 to 8 page paper next week, and you'll have a discussion about that sentence and whatever it is and whatever the idea is. And if you understand it already, they'll skip it because you only are trying to fill in the gaps in your knowledge, not show mastery.
Yeah.
And so that sort of self-teaching model, and then finding things where I have gaps. A lot of that all sort of boils into it. And it's just, read quite a bit, try to get into discussions with people on sort of tangential or completely separate fields of interest and disciplines, as much as possible. And so it's, so that's Montessori school on up.
Yeah.
I think it's ended up where I am.
I've written like several things. I'm like, ooh, I want to follow up on this and this and this. But I'll start with just one question, which I think I might have a pretty simple answer, and that is there such a thing as a polymath that is not an autodidact? Is there such a thing as the polymath who isn't a self-teacher?
I don't think so. I've actually had that question quite a bit with friends who have kids who are either in high school or in college, and who have similar sort of tendencies. And they're like, how do you shape and go deep on many different areas? And
one
part of
at a
it
time.
was just, yeah.
Or a few at a time. Yeah.
And it's just, figure out what you have a passion about or what you want to understand, and then find a resource for it, but then also find a good Sherpa or guide. And when at St. Mary's, I had quite a few really good guides, professors, professor of the college, who I'd have dinner with regularly and hang out with regularly. And he's like, oh, you have an understanding of this? And he's like, oh, you obviously know about this. I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. What's that word? And he's like, oh, here, read this. I was like, okay. So, and we would have discussions as I would start reading through things. I'm like, okay. And it was just, I think Montessori school sets sort of the curiosity in motion. There's also a really good article that was passed around this last week from 2012 on the value of polymaths. And it was in, I think, Forbes magazine. It was either Forbes or Harvard Business Review. Like, how do we make more of them? And one of the values that it left out was it was essentially looking at polymaths as not going deep. And you always want to go to the specialist. They'll have better knowledge going deep. And I have clients and friends who are continually, when I say the words, I don't know anything about this. And then I will start talking about what I don't know and how I don't know about it and the framing. And they're like, you just told us more than our expert. And you identified gaps.
Because you're aware of the limits of your knowledge, because you have knowledge in adjacent domains.
Yeah. And you can see the gaps, and you know where the natural gaps would be.
And you haven't always limited only that ecosystem, so you're aware of the water.
Yeah.
The David Foster Wallace quote. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's, you're looking at things and you're like, there would be a gap here. And quite often that gap within that domain isn't seen. And I'm like, I don't think I know anything about it because I don't know anything about this gap. And they're like, what gap? And they're like, here's how we work around that, or we haven't really addressed it because we haven't need to. I'm like, how do you go from here to get down to really understanding so that it's valuable and adaptive if you don't cover that gap? And they're like, we're working in best practices. I'm like, we're back to there again.
Our current context, period. Yeah.
And so
another thing I want to mention then, and thank you for sharing all of that. That was amazing. I won't do as deep a dive, but I'll instead just dive into the more interesting thing for future, which is Arthur Brock's other project, it's also part of Metacurrent, that he sort of did on the side on accident. He had set up a fairly self-directed learning school in Colorado. And then he had moved up to New York to be near his son when his son moved to New York. His son was enrolled in a school that was also sort of self-directed learning that like had a crisis. Like the entire staff quit, you know, because the principal or whoever was running the school was just not beloved. And they asked him to step in, and he was like, let me think about it. And he basically mapped out a different structure that he hadn't tried before, but he's like, I think we can do it this way. And he pitched it, and they were like, yes. So then he spent the next year like getting that school back up and running with this new model that then got copied the next year by another school, and then by 2 more the following year. And now they did a couple months ago, they did a facilitator training session with 30 folks from like a month or a month and a half. And basically he's created this movement or you know, different concept called Agile Learning Centers. And the people who run those are Agile Learning Facilitators. And they basically, he has put out a how to bootstrap your own Agile Learning Center document with all of the details, right? Like, this is as best we know, and it's open source, and you can hack it, and you know. But here's everything from fundraising to hiring administrators to, you know, how you train the teachers to, you know, finding real estate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of it, legal structure stuff, all the way down to like, what's the goal? How are you empowering the individual students to explore, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, yeah, that's good. I think I've run across that in the last 6 months to a year or so.
That could very well.
I don't remember. I think I entered into it from 2 different trajectories. One was sort of the agile side, which has been working in agile environments going back to 90s, partly because we was working on a skunkworks project and all of us were naive perhaps, and we were reading Slashdot and we're like, what do we need to be doing? And I'm like, XP, the extreme programming, agile, Scrum didn't come into it. And there was another piece that we had, and we were just like, okay, in order to do this with the lightweight team, starting with, I was the first one hired to build this thing and do proof of concept, and essentially had done that in about 2 weeks. And they're like, oh, you know, your 1 month contract is now 6 months. And at the 3 month mark, they're like, we now have you for a year. And it ended up being a team of about 30 of us building, starting in '99, built a system that was intended to be web-based, and it was browser-based, but it was taking all the data from U.S. Department of Transportation, bringing it into one interface where you could mix, match, and marry different data sets on the fly, pulling variables together, run lightweight analytics on the website, and do GIS interface on the web. And that was 99, 2000. But had built metadata viewers that were what I wish were there when I was in grad school looking at data sets. And I'm like a metadata viewer showing you, the cardinality, all the different rates. If it's continuous data, showing you, rough analytics on that, and then being able to show one of the odd things with a lot of the data sets that we're working with is the definition changes year to year. So a pickup truck in 1 year is not a pickup truck in another year because of weight load, other variables. Motorcycles shift year to year. So you're like, oh, I've got a pickup truck in this year. What year do I have a fungible description for a pickup truck? And then I can find other data around it. And then built it so that, if you knew a data set really well, you could work with the germane variable names and structures to query them, but then marry it with normalized data sets so not everything was normalized. And then we would give you warnings and saying, when you're bringing in weather, this database has 14 types of weather. This other one, the only thing that we can tell you is that it was clear, or there was precipitation, or cloudy. And the common normalization across everything is clear, not clear. And so we would have these various mappings as to what would work with what. But as it was scheduled to go live, we kept on warning that there was personal data that hadn't been scrubbed in the data sets we're using. And like the home phone number for somebody responsible for a natural gas pipeline leak, their desk phone, the name and social security number of somebody who died in a boating accident, as well as the same for the person who killed them. And so it was just, the way that things worked was this data set has been cleared to be distributed to the public, which meant that it got turned over to a contractor who did the cleaning. We were getting the data set straight from the folks.
Yeah.
But in building that, we were just like, okay, we were doing agile. We were incorporating all these ways to work very quickly and have rapid release cycles. And then we'd have a dog and pony show where we'd essentially have to fork everything we were doing, which we learned to do after the first one, because we were building in things for a demo that were dummied in. And then we'd have to figure out where we branched and go back. And so I'm like, okay, or actually with someone else who's like, we're just forking this code base. It's the dog and pony. When we're done with the dog and pony, 3 weeks of work, we throw the 3 weeks of work mostly away or set it aside and go back to building what we're building.
Yeah.
But it was, every 2 weeks we would have something that was drastically better. And we were kept on getting told by the large software vendors that what we were trying to do, even in small pieces, was technically not possible.
Sure.
And we're just like, part of it, we were naive enough not to believe it, and we also knew how to sort of hack our way into it. And our motto was, "It's kludgy enough, it just might work." And we're just like, how'd you do that? We'd walk through all these things, and they're like, that's not efficient.
Lots
like,
of
no, but we got it to work. Now we can optimize it. We showed that it's possible. Now we need to figure out how to make it cleaner.
Yeah.
And worked with a brilliant GIS guy who had taken the Esri product. It was like 30 seconds to build a map. Like the first screen to come up, because it had, in 2000, it had 13 to 15 different JavaScript calls. And he got it down to one, which was just the screen size. And all the other calculations were done on the server side, which had far more power. And all you were doing is posting a set map up.
Actually, so I do know that Arthur, some of the stuff they're working on at the moment with Scepter, a specific place that he has expressed a desire for help or thought
Cool.
is in particular load balancing across multiple devices.
Okay.
So you can say, hey, this type of stuff I don't really want being processed on my cell phone,
Yeah.
like that to be done on my little, adjacent my computer or my server in the cloud, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And they might have some concepts there, but he has definitely sort of stated, hey, if anybody can help, like just give us some guidance on how we might want to go about doing this, that'd be great.
Yeah.
I would love to connect you for multiple reasons.
Cool. Yeah.
But that's one off the top of my head. Another might be, so because they're doing these semantic trees, and they've basically created a semantic tree parser, and the trees kind of eat themselves, like the way that that the code runs is, they're sort of like, it works its way. I think it eats its way to the root. It would be I think that's how it eats it. It's kind of interesting in that you can be in the middle of running a process, can stop the thing, and later could pull it out of cold storage and restart it right in the middle of that process.
Cool.
Just because of how that architecture works. And I think already at this point in the conversation, I'm pushing up against the outer limits of my ability to explain technology. So.
That's fine.
But the stuff that you had mentioned during that 99 project around viewing, being able to go and view the metadata and essentially get different views on the metadata, right? And possibly, like my vision of this stuff was like, you're able to view the object or the entity, whatever. You're able to view the metadata. You're able to view the metadata about the metadata. You can go to, if you have a system that works right, like you can chase yourself down the rabbit hole to whatever, wherever is useful or interesting to you to help you, make those decisions. But my belief is that the stuff that Arthur and crew are building should make that type of thing very easy. And what they've been experiencing is that as they've started to build these layers, their initial rudimentary tools have proved incredibly helpful in building out the later stuff, like more so than they were anticipating. They were thinking like, oh, maybe it'd be cool that we could, like once we got this little tool, they're like, no, it's like development's going because everything's just moving along sort of so quickly because they're able to leverage the stuff they've already built.
Cool.
And so part of my, in January, they're planning to kind of launch whatever they've got, basically, whether they're going to call it a alpha or a prototype or just a proof of concept, right? Whatever level is specific. But they're launching that. And the truth is, I don't want to use the word target market because I think it's more appropriate to call it intended community. Their intended community is folks like you.
Okay.
Right? Like it's people who have deep knowledge of they've been trying to solve problems like these. They've built these systems in the past, and this is supposed to be just an open source public layer that you can take and change entirely, but for people to build upon. And so they are hoping to gain attention from other communities, the people who are interested in sort of agile processes and all these different, more social, what is the impact of all this stuff, minded folks, because they want people both to know about it, but also be able to start to support it. But in terms of actually using the tools, like they're like, hey, this is a developer tool. Like what we're building right now is a developer tool. Will it make it easier for non-developers to do development? Yes, it will. But the UX ain't going to be, this is day one. Like it's going to be a limited set of folks that are like, let me get in there and endure the pain to reap some benefit. So,
cool. Yeah, that sounds good.
I had one or two other things. I don't know if there's any of them that are important. I will say for me on the, how did I end up here, being somebody who also gets called a polymath. And I think actually a lot of it was the religion that I was raised in. Part of it was that I moved around a ton. So I got to see a lot of different contexts. And that made it so that I was like, oh, it's the way that I was living over there is not how everybody lives, So these things change. And so that was one piece. But the other was I was raised as a Christian Scientist. Which is sort of like generally don't go to doctors, and at the core of that religion is this belief that like this stuff, the physical world, isn't real. Like it's not that it's not real; it's just not substantial. Like it's not what matters. And I recently found out that three of the people who were most aligned and working on this stuff were also raised in Christian Science, and now we're no longer Christian Scientists. One of them was Arthur, and another was a guy named Noah Thorpe, who runs a extreme programming-ish software consultancy / incubator that's trying to do these kinds of like change the structure of the internet projects called Citizen Code. But all three of us were raised as Christian Scientists, and all three had stepped away. And Noah's point on why that might have been the case, like how that would have led us to be here. He was like, well, Christian Science sort of trains you to be the most skeptical human ever.
Yeah.
Because from day one, you're like, you can't trust anything. Like, you can't trust any of your friends, you know?
Yeah.
And so there was that piece. But then there was also, I know for me, just really supportive parents who were like, they didn't want to raise children. They wanted to raise adults. That was kind of and in order to do that, it was like, go explore and make your mistakes now. Like, try things. And so there was always that encouragement and freedom to just pursue, like you had said, pursue whatever you were interested in.
Cool. Yeah, I think the moving around, I moved around a ton growing up. And it was, all up and down the West Coast. But it was sort of learning to stand back and watch. And it's like, what I did in the last place isn't the way things work now. And it was born in the Bay Area, moved Spokane, Washington, Seattle, Portland, Los Angeles, and then went to high school in Stockton. And when we moved to Stockton, I was half thinking, what did I do wrong that we ended up here? Because it was like the smallest place. And I'm like, man, this place is so boring. The clouds don't even show up in the summertime. It's just like blue sky and hot all summer. And it was under 100,000 people when we moved there in 78. I actually moved there in junior high, and it was insane culture shock. And by the time I had lived in beach community in Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles, and had sort of embraced like surf culture and OP shorts, and wearing that in Central Valley, which was indiscernible from Kansas or anywhere else, between the Appalachians and the Altamont, it was just not something that you did. They're like, what are you wearing? And like, fortunately, my dad, he'd been working there for about 6 months and stumbled into karate, and he's like, hey, why don't you do karate with me? And because I was continually having to defend myself, and little did we know that kids were trying to beat me up because I looked different, wore different things, and just like crud. And by that point, I'm like, I didn't care what I wore. Well, I cared what I wore, but I didn't want to wear what they were wearing. And I'm like, I don't care. I'm like, I don't care if I fit in. And
you know what? I think that I honestly believe that statement right there, I don't care if I fit in, may be a critical component. Yeah. Right? Because being comfortable with not fitting in gives you so much freedom to go to not have to check for permission.
Yeah.
We're exploring. Yeah. Sorry, keep going.
On that tangent, it was the great thing about the web, because on the web I could find other people with similar interests. And I'm like, the web allowed me to essentially live anywhere. And could find moved from San Francisco in '93, had been working there for 5 years after college. And largely because I didn't see a future in IT and tech. And I'm like, okay, it doesn't pay well. It's like one step above custodial service. And like everything flowed downhill, hit IT, and what went through IT, the janitors picked up. And I was like, I gotta find something.
Oh, how things have changed.
Yeah. Well, it changed in the 2 years when I was in grad school, because like 94, 95 had friends calling me up and shooting email, and they're like, you got to get back out here. All this crazy stuff you were talking about and that you were saying, this is going to happen soon, is happening. And they're just like, we need some help understanding it. I'm like, no, I promised myself I'd finish grad school, public policy, and stay here for 2 to 3 years after I finish. And I just ended up staying. But it was like this odd shift, but the internet allowed some of my superficial interests, like, giant scores, getting them live, and not having to wait 2 days. But also finding like Usenet groups and other things, and pockets of people who are thinking and asking the same questions. I'm like, how does this stuff work? this can't be the end of what we know about internet or information or other stuff. How do we get it to the next level? This isn't fully making sense.
Yeah.
Which is, sort of the early years of South by Southwest, which was sort of the hackers, the people who are building things and trying to build things better. And it sort of shifted from the makers to the clickers, to the people talking about the clickers, to the people talking about the people talking about the clickers.
So it's gotten better.
People, yeah. 2008 was my last South by Southwest year, because I was just like, I don't understand. It was way too many people. I couldn't track down the people that I would have face-to-face time with once a year. And I'm like, I can hop on Skype, I can do other stuff, catch up with them. But it's just massive crowds of people who don't want to understand what they're talking about. They just want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And so,
or be seen talking about it.
Exactly. It just got very meta, and I'm like, I really missed the makers and the explorers. And so I was just like, okay. And people were like, hey, can you come back and sit on a panel? I'm like, I don't know. And so I've just completely skipped it. And it just, always trying to find, sort of the explorers and the makers. And just like, okay, what do we know? And, that being comfortable with not fitting in, that works really well. Also, you'd mentioned something just sort of about this not trusting anything. And it was after and separated from my wife, was going through therapy. And we were just going through all sorts of different things. And it was a Jungian psychologist, and I didn't know how much that mattered until looking back on it a couple years later. But hit upon there were some things that were said. I'm like, you can't say that. There was one point where he's like, what the fuck are you thinking? And I'm like,
well, you're supposed to be supportive.
Like, well, I'm completely confused. This doesn't work like the movies. And
that was stupid. What were you?
Yeah, I was like, how did you think that was going to work? I'm like, what do you know that I don't know? What? Like, and how? But he'd when I was like somewhere around 18 months old, I got just incredibly sick, just really bad pneumonia, and was in the hospital for about 10 days, strapped to a bed with needles going in my back to pull fluid out of my chest. And it was prior to my talking. And we started talking about that, and he's like, oh yeah. He's like, of course you've got trust issues. He's like, and because when my parents got me back, the hospital warned that I was going to be wild, like a wild animal, and like a wild cat. And they're just like, he's going to lash out. He's not going to be touched. And one of the things that they didn't do because it would disturb me was touch. And so 10 days as a small kid, not touched, couldn't talk, explain that I was in pain, anything. And it's just like, I'm like, had no clue that, and it's the point in life where you're able to retain memory and that stuff sticks with you, but you're not able to talk about it. So it had sort of deep lack of trust of anything and of anything being there. And like, there's going to be these times that are just going to be these pit of horror. And it was just like people, and I was like, crud. And it was one of those moments where it was like this huge epiphany of like, crud, a lot of the things that I don't trust and the ways that I am are based on things that are not relevant, because it was, this foundation. It was one of those moments where the psychologist was like, hey, look at that, time's up, we'll catch you next week. And I was like, what? I don't know who I am at the moment.
It's gonna be a really hard week.
Like, I just went home and just like turned off the lights, sat in the corner. I'm like, crud, like thinking back to all these points, and I'm like, where I just sort of like break down or just sort of get very frustrated and angry with things because I didn't know, and I was expecting in my head there was a very strong neural connection to that was going to trigger another one of these. You're going to be strapped to a bed, needles in your back. We're not going to touch you for 10 days. Horror episodes again. And I was like, crud. And I'm like, a lot of how I experienced things and attempt to rationalize things in an irrational way. I had this irrational behavior. And I'm like, I don't know I don't know who I am or why. And so it's like that very skeptical of everything. I'm like, oh, here's the truth. And is it really the truth? And being also having the ability to hold incongruent thoughts in tension at the same time and be fine with that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, water's wet, water's on fire. Okay, I'm good with that. And can hold those and work through those. And I think part of it is like, I've been told this is the truth. I'm holding it as not the truth, or as fact for now. And, you know, it's an awful lot of like, okay, if it happens, I'll believe it. And then sort of learning to have faith in things, but yet deep skepticism. I'm an optimistic pessimist. I look for the ways that everything is going to break and try to figure out how to counter for all of those. And which has led to an awful lot of gap filling in. I'm like, I don't understand this piece. How does that work? How do I ensure that that isn't going to fall apart? Let me understand that a bit. Okay, I'm good with that. And my level of being good with that tends to go rather deep. And so, having the level of expertise of, my thinking, I know absolutely nothing about something, and then having more understanding than experts do on things. I'm like, because I know where the gaps are. And part of it is like, no, I need to know what's going on to be comfortable with it, to know where that space is. Yeah. And so it's just like, okay, I know where the missing manhole covers are. I need to close those in, or
I think for myself, and I'm guessing this is the same for you, that there is so much. I think, unlike many people, when you navigate life, you do have a pretty solid theory or framework for understanding what's happening. And so you're accustomed to knowing, right? To having this really solid guidance system. And so that makes it so that when you don't have that, it's like, well, I need it. Like, let me go get it. And whereas I think that the vast majority of people pretty early on in life go, there's just some stuff you can't know. Yeah, you just gotta be comfortable with it. Fuck it, let's go get a drink. And I think at some level it's like, no, I'm spoiled. I'm spoiled because just about everything I ever looked at, I was able to figure out. And so I'm used to understanding. Like, I'm used to having an understanding. And for me, Christian Science was really problematic in that way, because it was like, wait, I don't fully understand. Like, I get this and this and this, but like, where's the, this is the underlying assumption, but you just have to assume it. And I essentially got driven back in my early 20s to the place where you were just talking about, which is, I don't think you can know, but I think based on your experience, you can go, well, this seems useful, and I haven't found something else that's more useful, so I'm going to go with this. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means from what I've been able to perceive, it seems to be working the best. And I don't think as humans we can do any better than that. And at the end of the day, like, the types of systems that I'm working to build are about enabling us to do that while leveraging the insights and experiences of others as well, to the extent that they're willing to, share those with us and and
Yeah.
yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, there's sort of a one of the traits I've picked up is being very comfortable with being wrong and assuming when new information comes in, I'm like, let me assume everything I know around this is wrong, and then being able to very quickly go through and I'm like, is this right? Is what I know right? And being able to like throw everything out and it's like adopt something new and very
That
at
is a
time.
really unusual pattern, and I don't know that. Like, I think I've got a general. I think I'm generally good about like, okay, I'm willing to question my assumptions.
Yeah.
But I don't think I have that habit that you just described. And I'm wondering if you have almost a ritual associated with that, or if it's only in stuff like that's sort of like shocking that comes in as new information that you're like, okay, I'm going to go and be willing to question everything. Like, how does that actually work?
Yeah, part of it, I think there's like two pieces to it. One is sort of the Oxford sort of filling in the gaps and understanding where your gaps are. And it's like, well, maybe what I understand isn't right. And, within the 8 weeks and the 2 weeks prior and after, so the 12-week session that I was there, you learned the skill set to evaluate things very quickly. And then one of the other pieces was when I was in Oregon in the 70s, was sort of the time of transcendental meditation, the power of positive thinking, the Tim Galloway stuff, and that whole track of things. And my parents got looped into both of those. And being an only kid, I went with them. So I went through TM, got my mantra and stuff when I was 9 years old or 10 years old. And then also went with them on these power of positive thinking seminar weekends through Pacific Institute up in Seattle, and having an awful lot of sort of pop psychology, sort of cog-sci stuff of learning to not build in limitations. And so being able to always look for the other side of things or the other dimensions of things. Being I'm not going to go explore that because I think I have an answer to this, but encourage others to go find and challenge it to be what I know is wrong. And it's like there's a few people who I interact with quasi regularly, and they'll go off on deep dives. I'm like, you're going down a dead end path, but I'm like, here are the gaps in it, and I'm like, you may prove it wrong. Go crazy. And they've hit the dead ends, and they're like, yeah, there's nothing really there. And like one of them is trying to find the one true agile approach. And have now worked in 30 to 40 different agile environments, and none of them are similar enough to others. And to be, you can sit down in one, like there are whole tenets that are just not used or introduced, and pieces of Scrum, or there's no user stories in some. And it all depends on sort of the culture or subculture that they're in, how and why they're formed that way, and trying to teach people about Agile and to feel like, oh, we're dropping into an Agile environment and it's their first time. And I'm like, we got to figure out the flavor. And I'm like, what do you mean? And I'm like, they're like, where's
Robin?
Yeah, where's the canon for Agile? I'm like, well, it came out of Microsoft, and sort of there's one book that's pointed to, but nobody followed it. Microsoft didn't follow it. But it's everybody has interpretations on that, and you have to go into it going, I understand where you're trying to be. Everything's supposed to be iterative, release nothing before it's ready, which a lot of environments that goes out the window. because they have dates. And they're like, oh, we have to deliver by this date. Why is the date there? Well, we picked it. And I'm like, how? We need at least, minimal viable product. And it's like, okay, there's a whole lot of stuff, gaps and things that just aren't working. And you're building off a model of something, you're not building on a minimum viable product model. You're building on a sort of mid-release model of having all this feature and functionality. What are you going to throw out to get to that date? And there's all these odd conversations where I'm just like, how?
Because they don't know. They're not really fluent. Yeah.
Yeah. And I've been in environments that are heavily dogmatic on essentially like 3 or 4 of the different core flavors of Agile. And I'm like, they'll throw stuff out as well. And it's just like, okay. And have been working on the edges of those and like, this follows the core tenets of everything. And they run into gaps in it. And they're like, we had to modify this, or we're throwing in we've added Scrum to it. And, these three groups in our organization do have the Scrum approach, and the others don't have it because with daily reporting, there were too many red flags, and they just work out over a week. So we have a week reporting. And so they're just like, if somebody needs help, they throw up that flag. You throw up the I need help flag, but you don't throw this as a deal breaker flag. And it's just like there were a lot of deal breakers, and they needed a week to figure out which were real, which weren't.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so once you get farther away from core coding, Agile starts getting a little more fuzzy as to what you keep and not, or Scrum. And so it's like there are reasons why organizations will have 6 or 7 different versions of or interpretations of Agile running in the same one. And I'm like, hey, this product group is working very differently from this other product group. They're both using Agile. And like, that's normal.
And that reminded me of something that I meant to mention earlier, but I hadn't gotten to it before forgetting, which was I do think that one of the big promises eventually of Scepter, I don't think it's like a day one thing, is to enable folks to create those translation layers. That this is kind of like there's a fair bit of work in and of itself there between where you have people who are those bridges between those different cultures, those communities, but are able to go, okay, you guys are working in this way, these guys are working in this way, and when you say this, you mean blah blah blah, and they actually mean blah blah blah. And those types of essentially translation tools, right? Which are not just tool things; they end up being cultural process, etc. Pieces, and they're not. That's not stuff that gets solved by the tool. That's stuff that having the right tools can help the humans to go, oh, wait a minute, we are diverging culturally in ways that can cause problems, and what's the process that enables us to? It's usually more process stuff, to be honest. What are the ways that we can continue to maintain some sort of alignment so that the type of thing that you were talking about in internet communities where we've diverged entirely, so that either doesn't happen or can happen, and that's okay within the larger structure, In fact, John Seeley Brown and John Hagel and the other folks at Deloitte Center for the Edge, their whole thing with enterprise innovation is you need to isolate. They can't be too closely tied in. They shouldn't be tied in at all to the core folks, because there's a culture and a way of doing things and a perception of threat that exists there that will suffocate any new innovation from happening. And it completely agree on the on both the fit for purpose processes, tools, as well as that there is risk of divergence that creates culture wars at some point, or at the minimum not a coherent, moving forward as an organization that actually needs to ship product or or meet customer need.
Yeah. That was the thing with the Skunkworks that was really nice, is that we were completely separated from everybody else. And after like the first 2 months, we essentially were given a closet. And it was like a collection of closets that fed off of each other. There was no outside window. And it was like one main room where there was 4 of us, and the 3 of the leads, we each had desks in the corner. And then the GIS developer, who was quite often the thread between a lot of the technical solutions, just because he not only knew GIS, but the database stuff well enough. And I was building the CMS and the overall sort of architecture that held it all together, and interconnected things. He was helping me with that as well, and I could throw stuff over to him. But then we had 3 other side rooms. And one became the database group. One was another group we had, and then had a designer who was back with the servers on a large, it looked like the automated tennis machine, except it was a giant air conditioner that was just loud as all get out. And he was fine sitting back there, and that's where sort of the overflow desk was, or 2 desks were as well. But we were just completely separated, unmarked room, and
free to do.
Yeah, and just like, and we would interact with folks to get data and to understand data, and then start building in, adding data sets in, and understanding them as best we could, and heavily user testing what we were building.
Yeah.
But that separation's key.
Yeah. When you're trying to do new.
Yeah.
When you're not. So, there was actually a point from earlier, and this kind of ties in. So in one of the big sort of key takeaways that I took, and this is something that I had known for a long time, but I hadn't really articulated quite in this way, from that last, the last year of diving into ecosystems and how they function and all that.
Yeah.
One of the big key takeaways that I took was, at all times, there's, in any ecosystem, whether that's an organization, a nation state, a community, or a forest, there is a tension between 2 truths.
Yeah.
Use the taboo word. And that is the efficiency or effectiveness gains that come from centralization, and best practices is a form of centralization, right? Yeah. That it being in tension with the resilience benefits that come from diversity. And at any point in time, being able to focus more narrowly, or being able to have enough other, little other things on the side that are giving us the ability to sense the environment around us, or have some practices that that might also come into play. At any point in time, the balance between those 2 things is different, right? Or I shouldn't say the balance. The balance that will help you thrive is different. There are times where really it's a narrowing that's going to really give you the advantage. And there are other times where, whoa, we are way too narrow. We are vulnerable and brittle. And it's hard to know where you're at. I think, to be honest, the hardest part in any of this is gaining the ability to have that situational awareness of where you are in that life cycle. Are we we are in a competitive landscape, and we're trying to establish ourselves, and we found something that works. We need to stop investing our energy in these other things that might or might not work, and sort of hit repeat on this guy a bunch, Or are we, the other extreme end is we're the dominant player, and we've got this thing that's been spitting off cash for years, and we've honed it to a fine, and somebody's going to take us out next week with stuff that we're just not even paying attention to, because we don't even consider it to be the same industry that we're in.
being able to see everything is nearly impossible. And being able to figure out, had college roommates that continually were using the Pink Panther Cato phrase, when you least expect it, expect it. Which meant getting water dumped on you. There was something you just did not expect that was going to happen. You'd set a restaurant reservation to go out on a date, and you never booked in your own name, because if you did and they knew where it was, the restaurant, they would change the reservation. They're like, oh, Mr. Vanderwall, you were supposed to be here a half hour ago. You called yesterday and changed it. Oh, what? So it was just, and I didn't, that sort of like, quote, fun and games. I'm just like, I did not find any entertainment in that. And so I'm like, okay, it intended to not be predictable enough so that they didn't know what to expect. And so it was sort of like this odd game. I'm just like, don't mess. Just, I don't want to deal with that. And half the time I was like lost in thought anyway.
Totally.
And it's like, I need to go. There's a handful of books where it just like got pointed to, and like would just go grab them from the library and sit out on the lawn on like a Friday afternoon. Everybody's getting to go party and stuff. I'm like, crud, this is an amazing book. Like Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson was one of those. Where two kids are swapped at birth, one who is a royalty, another one a pauper, and swapped out, and it was highly entertaining. But I'm like, crud, this is really good. And it had me examining everything in the world around me. And I'm just like, I would just be lost in thought, and would have friends I would walk by like, hey, Thomas, how's it going? And I'm like, what's this? How? I'm like reassembling my world based on what I just learned. And it's just like,
let me ask
okay.
you this. Have you throughout your life, say high school and beyond, invested nearly as much time socializing and partying as your peers did?
I think high school definitely did. I didn't know how to study until I graduated from high school. And grades, I was bored with school. I couldn't understand how grades worked. I've proven that I knew something. Homework was just really bizarre concept in my head, because I could prove that I knew something and could do the work, but yet I had to do all of the work, which, we'd have like 10 easy problems, 10 medium problems, and 5 hard problems. And I do 2 of the easy, 2 of the middle ones, and tackle the hard ones. And, which meant I got a D on the homework, and it wasn't complete. I'm just like, okay, whatever. I showed you that I could do it. I'm not understanding how this game's supposed to work. You play your game. I'm understanding what I need for the test. And the high school I went to ran on a college system, so our tests were never in class. They were always in a testing center. So we scheduled them on our own free time, and we had a ton of free time. And quite often I would get lost in talking to friends or going and doing something and completely missed the first round of tests. So I would take the retest for a grade lower, and I'm like, I got an A, it shows up as a B. I'm good with that. And, combined with the D on homework, I'm getting a C. I'm like, okay, I'm passing. Just like I'm doing all the hard stuff. I've shown that I have mastery of whatever this is. Like, I don't understand how this whole thing works. And after high school I went to community college, because I couldn't figure why I would choose going to college without figuring out what I wanted to do to figure out which college was going to be best for that.
Yeah.
And was
Yeah.
working with a youth group. And one of the senior youth group advisors, he was a pharmacist, and he's like, "Hey, how are your study skills?" I'm like, "Oh, what's study skills?" It's like, how do you structure, reviewing things? And just, I had nothing. I just like would review things, do homework, and then just go take tests. And it just was easy. And then like, I would get most everything right on the tests, and usually for a grade lower. And it's just like, why do I need study skills? And so he mentored me over like 5 weeks on what study skills were and how to set a good routine. But in high school, I didn't really study much. Was usually out playing, doing other stuff. College was sort of a mix. Usually, usually didn't take things too seriously like the first month of a semester.
Yeah.
And unless I was sort of engaged in whatever the things were, or if I had good people in class. So for 2 semesters, I had really good classmates in our great books program. And between the three of us were almost always in unison on whatever the work was about, and sort of the self-teaching. The professor's like, what does Aristotle mean? Or, Thomas Aquinas, what are the core theories and what's he saying? And we all had read it, and in class figured out within 5 minutes we were on the same page. And I didn't realize until about 5 years after graduation that everybody in the class was terrified of us. And we're like, no, that's not right. Because and I'm like, the whole thing was trying to figure out if we were, on the right path, and to collectively get to the right answer.
Yeah.
And although there was one class where the 2 other guys weren't with me, and I'm like, crud, I know this is exactly what's going on. At the end of the session, professor's like, "Oh, Mr. Vanderwall is not correct." And I was like having battles with everybody. I'm like, no, it can't be that, because it says this and this, and there's all these setups, and this is the direction that it's going. And I went back and reread everything I'd read the next section, went back, and I was more determined and convinced that I was on the right path. And the 2 other guys, because the professor had said, they're like, "Yeah, we think you're right, but he said you're wrong. So we're going with these other, options and see if we can understand it." And like, went round and round to the class, the end of the class. He's like, "We've got one more session to go on this book." And he's like, "Mr. Vanderwall's not correct. Everybody go see if we can figure this out." And like, went back and reread the whole book that week, or in like the 2 days. And I'm like, I'm on the right path. I know this.
Yeah.
And get to the class, and at about the 2/3 mark through that 3rd class, he's like, "Mr. Vanderwall's been correct all along," but he's like, that would kill 3 days. He's like, he got it. He understood it early. I'm like, why'd you do that to me for? And I'm like, like, I've never had experienced that where I'm like, no, you're wrong, even though I was right, just to get everything else going.
Yeah.
And then my last semester of that, I didn't have any other good fodder and other students, and we all would challenge each other. And so I just, we were reading, I think, Don Quixote, and like, we were like 4 classes in, we hadn't gotten past like the 60th page yet of things we discussed. And professor is like, "See me after class." He's like, "You've been doing the reading, you just lead it and push it." And he's like, "I need you to do what you did the prior 2 semesters." And he's just like, "I know you don't have, Jeff and Ron with you, but," he's like, "Go." And he's like, "Everybody else will catch up." I was like, okay. And I'm like, it was also a smaller class. And so it was just, and there was a couple people who were apprehensive when I would start going. I'm like, this is what it means. It shows on this page. Here are the threads. And, but yeah, it's, I don't know where that one started. To circle back, Usually good at holding on to the circle.
No, I'm similar in that regard, which I think is why we are at the root, we're explorers, right? Like we enjoy that exploration process. But the root was socializing and drinking.
Yeah.
And for me, I'll kind of answer it pretty briefly. Similar high school experience up until sophomore year. So I had never done homework my whole life because I'd always aced the tests, and my parents didn't care about grades, So it was like, I got A's and B's and whatever. And then I moved when I was a sophomore. The beginning of my sophomore year, I moved from Korea back to California, and missed school for a month or so because we were like trying to decide if we were going to live in Santa Rosa, California, or San Luis Obispo. And so we were looking at homes and places, and my dad was trying to get a job. And by the time I was like settled in the San Luis Obispo area and enrolled in school, they were like, "Oh, well, you missed 30 days, so we're going to count those against you." And I was like, "What?" Wow. So I had like C's and maybe an F. I don't remember. I had lower grades, and I was like, "Oh, well, I was like hoping to go to college, like I wasn't sure, but like I was thinking about going to college." And I had a great teacher at Arroyo Grande High School named Mrs. Holgate, and she had taught at UCLA, and basically she was an English teacher, and English had always been my worst subject. Not because I wasn't good at English, but because prior to that, English had been about this is a adverb, and this, like, it was grammar. And the way my head works, I'm really great with abstract patterns. But I have a hard time holding on to names. Names of anything, not just names of people, but just labels. If I haven't used it in 3 weeks, my brain's like, not needed, and throws it away, And I see it on a multiple choice test. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one. But the connection to the name, I'm like, tip of my tongue. That experience is a really regular experience for me, which meant that grammar was not my strong suit. But by the time I was a sophomore, she was like, well, no, grammar isn't English. Like, you can talk, so you can write. And so she sort of took me under her wing, and also at that same time, I started surfing. And two things happened because of surfing. One, my parents were like, hey, if your grades slip, we're going to take away the surfboard. I'm like, you can't take away the surfboard. I bought the surfboard. They're like, we can take away the surfboard. I had worked that summer and saved up my pennies and bought a surfboard and a wetsuit and a VW bug. And they were like, trust me, we can take away your surfboard. So there was that. But then the other piece, which I didn't realize until much later, was because I started surfing, and I was surfing every day. It was very rare that I missed a day surfing. I was entering a flow state, right? I was throwing myself into a flow state because surfing is one of the best things in the world for that. You're moving across a surface, so you're trying to figure out how to move your body. That happens to be changing shape in a way that it has never changed shape before. So it is such a dynamic experience that there's no way to put it on autopilot. You're always having to be paying attention to what's happening so that you can adjust your path relative to the opportunities that are being presented. And so there's this amazing, challenge to skills ratio. Are you familiar with Csikszentmihalyi and flow and all of that stuff? So that is great because you get to decide, well, I'm scared. I don't want to paddle out for that. So I'll go surf over here instead. Or this is too small. It's boring. So you're always finding that thing that's sort of pushing the boundaries of your skill set. If the waves are boring, you try a new maneuver, right? So you're always losing yourself. And what would happen is I would, now looking back and I understand it, I would go surfing in the morning before school. My brain would be flooded with dopamine. I would walk in and I would just blow doors on everything. And I would be I was working as well all through high school. So I didn't have time to do homework in the evenings. So I'm in class listening to what's happening in math, but doing my Spanish homework. Right. And then I get to Spanish class and I'm like listening to what's happening in Spanish, but doing my English homework. And that was school for me. But what happened basically there was the threat of losing the surfboard combined with Mrs. Holgate's sort of nudging, she was like, you can go to college. Like, you definitely can go. You need, and she sort of walked me through the steps, because I was a firstborn. My parents hadn't gone to college in a traditional sense. Like, my dad had done sort of correspondence school. So I didn't know any of the how you do it stuff. And basically she walked me through that, but also I made a commitment basically at that point, after that sort of low grade semester, that, okay, I'm going to do my homework from now on. And so for the first time in my life, I started doing homework, and that sort of changed all the grades and everything like that.
Yeah.
But as an adult, partly because of surfing and partly because of just being interested in other things, I'm extremely social.
Yeah.
But I don't go to the bar.
Yeah.
You know, that's not the way that I tend to. I don't feel engaged. Like, hanging out and chatting about the same things that we talked about 10 times. Like, no. I've got enough amazing people in my life that I really like. I'm excited to talk to. Yeah.
It was always looking for a good conversation, and it either having conversations around what I was learning or talking to somebody with different experiences. And so it's going to parties was largely looking for good conversations. And St. Mary's was a small college, and so there was only 2,000 students. It was smaller than my high school. Mm-hmm. And fortunately I had transferred in after 2 years. But it was very funny, because it was transferring in after 2 years, all the students my grade and my age, they knew everybody. So I was like the new kid. And so it was just like, like, we're bored with everybody. So it was easy for like a year and a half to have like interesting conversations, try different things.
You were a new kid who had been the new kid 7 times before.
Yeah. I was comfortable being the new kid. Yeah. And it just, and I also assumed that nobody knew who I was. And it was, which sort of had me labeled as aloof, because like being the new kid, everybody knew who I was. And so they're just like, new guy. And I'm like,
totally.
Not only are you new
guy.
That
is so funny. I never thought about that.
But it's like one of like 40 new students in a class of 400. And I'm like, so all the students are talking about the new people who have just come in. So I'm like, not only do they know who you are, but it spreads quickly as to who you are. And it was just like, and I'm like, I just wouldn't say hi to people. And because I figured out they don't know who I am. And I had no clue that most everybody knew who I was. And I'm like, why doesn't he say hi to us? He doesn't like us. And I was just like I completely did not understand this. And then in high school, one of my coping mechanisms to sort of get along, and part of it was being bored, was to sort of play the dumb guy. I continually joke around. I was raised by a pack of wild sitcoms. And so like the dumb character in the sitcoms, like the next door neighbor, Howard in the Bob Newhart show, was like my favorite dumb character. And I was just like, would do dumb things, sort of did the Chevy Chase pratfalls. And I'm like, it was a way to sort of entertain and engage when I didn't know what the conversation should be or could be. And had figured out ways to have double meaning conversations, if not triple meaning conversations, where I'm like, I can take this conversation 2 or 3 different ways. Let me keep the terms ambiguous enough that people will not understand what plant I'm talking about, whether, it's a plant that grows, it's just, a plant you manufacture something in. And I'm like, let me see if I can just play with that. And that's how I entertain myself at times. And I had one teacher who was like, would you just stop this? Like, you've been talking outside my classroom, but I'm like, I don't mind the talking, but I can't figure out what you're talking about because it's making sense. I keep on
multiple levels.
She was waiting for a marker to have the conversation go, ah. And she's like, I continually hear you doing this. It's not just one conversation. You do this continually. I'm like, I'm sorry.
Finally, somebody had called you out on it.
Yeah, but it had gotten to be such a normal pattern, I didn't realize that I would do it. And it was just, and after, like going back after my parents had passed away, would hang out with friends who I hadn't seen in a while. And Facebook also was sort of similar sort of thing, and catching up with folks I hadn't seen in 20 years since high school. And they're like, you always had a huge vocabulary and we're smart. And I'm like, crud, that dumb kid thing didn't work. And I'm like, how did that not, like, I figured that was the way to fit in with everybody. I got along with everybody. And it was just like, how, like, huh. And it's, my mom was always, her idea of motivation was telling me how horrible I was going to be if I didn't get something done. Like, you're never going to have a job above like gas station attendant. You're no good at this, so you need to work harder. And I'm like, and as soon as I stopped listening to her and I started learning like study skills and getting grades just to challenge myself and to say, oh, grades are important in this game. I'm going to focus on getting good grades. I don't care what my mom says. I started just acing everything. I'm like, oh, okay. And I wasn't really putting in any more work, but I figured out how to play the game and stay within the rules of the game. And which my friend, when he was talking about Montessori school stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, there's all sorts of points in life where I just like, these are the rules. I'm like, okay, let me play at the edges of the rules. I don't like your rules. Or it's not, I don't like your rules. I don't understand your rules. And I'm like, I'm doing what I think I need to be doing and getting to the underlying meaning of what your rules are there for. And I'm doing that. I'm like, I don't understand why I have to do this other stuff if I'm following the rules, but I wasn't necessarily following the rules. I was sort of pushing and creating my own. I'm like, okay. But it was an odd, college was sort of an odd thing because I sort of woke up in college as to being comfortable with geeking out on things and learning things and finding other people who I could go deep with. And that was really nice. And some of that was just hanging out with professors and office hours just to hang out and have good conversations. And like identifying gaps that I had. And I didn't have grammar growing up because I moved around so much. I had always missed it, or it had just happened, or it was going to be the next year that it was going to be the heavy grammar focus. Yeah. And I got through high school without ever having formal grammar.
Yeah, I think that might have been part of my issue as well. Like I had amazing vocabulary because of being homeschooled at one point and us doing some incredible vocabulary stuff and an understanding of how words were structured and their roots and all that. So that was super solid, but I don't know that I really ever did the full grammar thing ever.
Yeah. I was actually learning German that I started learning English grammar. And like, oh, this relates back to this. I'm like, I have no idea what you're pointing to, but I understand how to structure it in German. And they're like, through learning German grammar structure, I learned English grammar structure.
That's funny.
It was like,
okay. Two quick things, and we should probably wrap it up because it's been 3 hours, but it's been amazing. This has been fun. One, you mentioned games, and I do think that part of being a polymath, and this is the autodidact thing, is that we tend to be good at finding games everywhere. We're always trying to figure out how to turn that thing into a game so that it's fun. And at some level, that means we've been spoiled in our lives into thinking that everything should be fun.
Yeah.
Right? Like we've had enough good, fun experiences where we're like, I don't want to waste my time on crap that's not entertaining.
Yeah.
And kind of related to the stuff you had talked about earlier and sort of building on that point, I've often described myself as an epiphany junkie, right? As somebody who, yes, I've always pursued flow when surfing, but I've also pursued that high through diving in, through understanding, through trying to build something, and those aha moments, those insights that you were referring to earlier. I think of myself as an epiphany junkie because I'm aware that that's what drives me to act. And I had written some blog posts recently about this. It was essentially about yes, I want to change the world. I would like there to be an impact. So there's this like desire, and that comes from thinking that the world's screwed up and needs to be fixed, right? So there's that. Yep. There's also this exploration part of like, ooh, let me gain an understanding. And I was like, but the truth is I overinvest in building understanding because I get high every time I get one of those little like, oh, it works like this, Yeah. And then the other part is, doing the actual building a business, the minutia, the steps for taking that understanding and applying it and creating value for others. And I do that, but I think I still underinvest in that because I don't get high in the same ways. And so I'm trying to sort of shift that in ways where it's like, no, I am getting high in those ways. And in fact, for me, there's a sort of a realization on this front a few months ago about how I don't code regularly because I'm not yet fluent enough with software development to get high doing it. It's not where, so my level of fluency is still too low for me to have gotten beyond, this is 3 days of frustration. I'm just hitting my head. I'm not getting the pay. And so I'm like, I just go back into, I can do wireframe mock-ups. That's fun. I can do the political philosophy stuff. That's fun. But I was like, okay, I need to put it, if I really do want to do software development stuff as me doing it, which I do. I want to have that fluency. Like I have to put in enough time to develop sufficient fluency to where I'm getting high.
Yep. Yeah. It's the internet essentially, became that sort of high. And it's like through one of the worst things I found growing up was being bored, because I was going to find ways to not be bored. And that meant pushing the limits on everything. And I'm like, oh, how fast can I go on a skateboard? Let me tie a sheet around my ankle, go hop on a skateboard in 45-mile-an-hour winds. And just surf surf the winds in Stockton because it was windy as hell. And then I realized, crap, I'm 5 miles away from home, and now I've got to. It's dark.
Go upwind.
I'm like, this really sucks. I hadn't completely figured that out. I'm like, holy crap, this is amazing. And I had friends with mopeds that I could go faster windsurfing on my skateboard than they could go on their mopeds. And it was one of those times being timed where I started getting speed wobbles and my feet were numb. And I hadn't really learned how to slow down properly. And one of my friends who was timing me enjoyed sailing. He's like, oh, just pull it in. And I didn't realize as I pull it in, I need to pull up as well. And I ran over the sheet at 35 miles an hour. which is a dead stop. And I tore my shirt on the back because I had slid so far. My shirt had come over and was on the front of me. And I had also knocked the wind out of myself. But other than that, I was perfectly fine. And I was just like, crud. So there was like all sorts of things like that, and just pushing the edges. How far can I push something before something breaks? I'm like, where's the breaking point? If I hang on the breaking point, I can always jump back to the safe side. Yeah. And I'm like, with the internet and being able to go after sort of intellectual pursuits, it trailed off the more physical edge pushing that I was continually doing. And
And that's really interesting. I wonder how common that dualism is. The polymaths that are also physical risk takers, or were at one point. I mean, I'm a big wave surfer. I know my dad was almost suicidal. He was so risk taking ish, like the opposite of risk averse. A friend of mine named Corwin Hardham was like an incredible windsurfer and kite surfer who was also just a brilliant mechanical engineer. Passed away a few years ago, but just, I wonder how common that is. Because for me, it is exactly the same thing, right? Like, why is it that I surf 40, 50-foot waves at Mavericks?
Yeah.
Eventually, like, that was what it took. I was comfortable with all the other stuff, and that was what it took to be pushing my boundaries and being at that edge of the comfort zone.
Yeah.
And it was just the natural consequence. Yeah.
Yeah, that was very much that way with cycling, and it was very much a need for speed. And when I was in San Francisco, I rode a lot and would head up to the headlands after work, or go down, lived in the Haight-Ashbury and then on Arguello. And so I could get down to the ocean easily and do in the middle of winter, got out of work early enough at 4:30, I could be home and get a half-hour ride in and just push it hard. Yeah. And there was times where, coming down the headlands or going down through the Presidio, and it's foggy, it's damp, and the tires start coming out from underneath you, and everything slows down to just nothing time, and I get down to the bottom and I'm still on my wheels, and I'm just like, oh, okay, I don't know how that happened, but I'm like, okay, that's cool. That was awesome. Yeah. And then the only real disastrous one I had was going up the Mount Tam, and was a friend and I were going to ride to the top of Mount Tam, and I got heat stroke going up, and the ground turned liquid on me, and where everything just is fluid. My brain is interpreting everything as just completely fluid and wavy. And the guy I was riding with is like, oh, we got to turn and go back. I'm like, no, I'm fine. Let's keep going. He's like, no, you're not doing well. And then going down, I was leading going down, and there's a corner going, out to Muir Beach, but coming back from Muir Beach and headed back to Larkspur, where there's a corner that banks the wrong way. It's like a 120-degree turn and through the trees. And my friend had come around me. He's like, let me lead. And I didn't get back out for the corner. And we hadn't seen cars in a while. And my tires started coming out, and thinking, okay, I just need to take the corner wide. And I look through the trees, and there's an old pickup truck coming up the mountain with a trail of cars. And I'm just like, okay, the mountain's not moving as fast as the cars. So I took 2 strokes and went right in front of the pickup truck. And as soon as I hit the white line and hit the brakes hard, hit the gravel, pounded straight into Mount Tam and the side of the mountain. Cracked my helmet, had Bucci sunglasses and nylon that are unbreakable. They broke just from the impact. And I hit the mountain, and then the bike hit me, and bent the forks completely back under. And my friend heard me yell. And when I crossed the white line, I looked back, and all I saw was the passenger door handle on the pickup truck. So I didn't miss the front of it by much. And had gravel embedded in my face and other stuff. I'm just sitting there brushing out, and I still have a piece of Mount Tam stuck that didn't come out. And but it was like one of those things. I'm like, crud. I pushed it a little bit too far, but I'm just like, in that moment where I was just like, 35, 40 miles an hour headed downhill, and I'm like, having tires sliding out, the ground is completely liquid, and having the presence of mind to go, mountain's not moving as fast as the truck. I need to get to the mountain as fast as I can. And just like, my crud. And I was like, okay, I pushed it. And then it was about 6 months later, 7 months later, could afford to get a new bike again. And, after a month of getting back in shape, went up and went through that spot again. I'm like, I got to go through it. Yeah. And it was fine. It was only then that I realized that it banked the wrong direction. And that was my issue. And I had gone through it 50 times or more prior and no issues. Sure. But it was like going out, heading out toward Muir Beach. I usually figured that was where I was going to meet impending doom. Just because of the switchbacks. And the first 2 times I went out to Muir Beach, I would go to sleep at night and all I saw was trees coming at me. And because you're just like going fast, slamming on the brakes, hammering into the corner, going down the next, sprinting, slam on the brakes, back again. And I was like, okay, this is fun. And it was just like, that got me going. And I'm just like getting, those endorphin rushes. And get the dopamine going. I'm like, okay, and
on that front, so
get me going.
I've got a theory. I've got a theory about humans, and I think this actually extends beyond humans to other creatures. But basically, we get rewarded for doing physical work through adrenaline and some other neurochemicals as well, basically, and that ends up rewarding us for building specific muscles, right? Like you've pushed your limits physically, your body's like, here's some adrenaline. We're like, yay!
Yeah.
Dopamine we get not for muscles, but we get for neural pathways.
Yeah.
Dopamine essentially shows up when we are mapping new neural pathways, and it makes it easier for us to do so. By shutting down certain portions of our frontal cortex and basically enabling it so that more of our real-time processing capacity is available to be focused on the task at hand, and having to keep track of time or what other people think of us or whatever else. It rewards us for that. And my take on it is that dopamine, flow states, etc., that what that really is and why it was favored evolutionarily is that it rewards us now for behavior that benefits us long term. We get high off of learning, improving our skill set in some way, but the long term consequence of that is we end up with a really well developed skill set. And so when you watch puppies wrestling other puppies or birds chasing one another, they're not doing it because they're practicing for something down the line. They're doing it because their brains get high. By taking on the challenge that is, that pushes their skill set. They're like, wow, this is amazing. This is so fun. And so that the neurochemical side of play, the neurobiological side of play, and why that was evolutionarily favored. For me, that was actually diving into that and gaining a deeper understanding of not only that in general, but my personal neurochemistry and how lack of sleep will throw me into a flow state, too much sleep will throw me into a depression, all these other things. And but also, hey, in a depression, there's certain types of work that I can do, and that I just can't do when I'm in a flow state. And when I'm in a flow state, there's definitely stuff I can do that I can't do when I'm low. And sort of realizing that was probably the most fruitful stuff that I've come to understand over the last couple of years.
Cool.
Personally.
Yeah, that was part of going through therapy. That was one of the things that also was highlighted. And it was just we discussed that a fair amount. He's like, oh, do you self-medicate? And I'm like, no, not understanding. I'm like, I know certain amounts of coffee, this and that, and exercise, other things. He's like, no, you're self-medicating without medication. He's like, caffeine, but then other things to know how to get what you need to do things. And one of my issues is sort of sleep.
at times, and when my sleep gets messed up, it's not good. And it sort of triggers at times where I think that I can't cope at times, and just like it gets into bad traits and just like start to overreact. And I know that I do that, so I will back off of things. I'm like, okay, all's good. Just need to get through this.
That's where I'm at right now. The head is playing games, but yeah.
How do I get this sleep? Because usually bad sleep triggers more bad sleep because it creates paranoia and other things, which, the irrational side, body overreacting to things that are supposed to protect us, but doing it to things that are harmless.
Yeah.
And which is, allergy issues as well. And body in the last 5 years has picked up new allergies in just like extreme ways at times. I'm like, no, this is fine. How do I have this conversation with my body that this is fine? I can eat this. I can do this. Don't kill me trying to do something good.
Awesome. Well, Thomas, this was great. I'm going to make a couple intros. I want to introduce you to Art Brock as well as Christopher Allen for obvious reasons on both those fronts.
Yeah, I've met Christopher a long time ago, but I have been running across his things, particularly going through expert witness stuff. And I'm like, I really need to reconnect. And I'm like, what's he up to? And so that would be great.
Yeah. And this is what he's up to, basically, is trying to, build the next layers and to a certain extent, build community, pull together the community who's building that stuff. So then that's what he's been doing. Okay. And then with Art, you'll have lots of stuff to connect on. But in particular, I think there's two sides. One, just is there a way, like if you're able to gain some understanding, are there ways that you might go, ooh, I want to use that to do this, right? Just for you to be able to use. And then other stuff along the lines of being able to bring in your user experience or other background stuff and go, when you get to this point, let's play, or I want to build on top of this and do my own thing or whatever, right? So would like to have that, because I think Art will be able, you two having a conversation, your depth of knowledge and the hands-on nature of your experience, you guys will be able to go to a level of detail that I'm not going to be able to go into because I don't know Scepter, like the underlying architecture, nearly as well as they do.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks. This was great.
More soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you, buddy. Bye.
You're welcome. Thanks. Bye-bye.